Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we journey through the complete story of Archimonde the Defiler, one of the most powerful demon lords ever to threaten Azeroth. His tale spans 25,000 years, from the shining spires of Argus to his final destruction in the Twisting Nether, a saga of ambition, betrayal, and apocalyptic destruction. As you settle in and let your breathing slow, allow yourself to be transported across time and space to witness the rise and fall of a being who nearly brought about the end of all things. Long before the worlds we know existed in their current forms, long before humans walked the plains of the eastern kingdoms or orcs gathered in the valleys of Draenor, there existed a world of unparalleled beauty and advancement. This world was called Argus, a planet where magic flowed as naturally as water, where towering crystalline spires reached toward violet skies, and where a race of beings known as the Eredar had built a civilization that would become legendary across the cosmos. The Eredar were not simply magical beings. They were masters of the arcane arts in ways that few races across the great dark beyond could comprehend. Their cities gleamed with enchantments woven into every stone. Their scholars delved into mysteries that touched the very fabric of reality. Their society represented the pinnacle of magical achievement, a beacon of knowledge and power that shone across the stars. At the heart of this magnificent civilization stood three leaders who guided their people with wisdom and purpose. The first was Velen, the prophet, blessed with the gift of sight that allowed him glimpses of futures yet to unfold. He was renowned throughout Argus for his compassion and his philosophical approach to existence, always seeking meaning in the patterns of fate and time. The second was Kil'jaeden, whose brilliant mind was matched only by his boundless ambition. He was a genius among geniuses, a leader who thrived on unraveling the secrets of the cosmos. Where Velen sought wisdom, Kil'jaeden sought knowledge, and he pursued it with an intensity that made him formidable in ways that transcended mere magical power. And then there was Archimonde. He was younger than the other two, having risen to join their ranks through a combination of natural talent and calculated maneuvering. Where Velen was contemplative and Kil'jaeden was intellectual, Archimonde possessed a different sort of gift entirely. He had an instinct for recognizing the strengths in those around him, for inspiring confidence, for commanding loyalty. He was bold in a way that drew others to him, and his confidence bordered on what some might call arrogance. Archimonde served as master of the Augari, a prestigious position within the Conservatory of the Arcane that placed him at the center of eredar magical research and development. In this role, he worked closely with the greatest minds of his people, overseeing projects that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. He earned respect through his accomplishments and his ability to bring out the best in those who served under him. But beneath his charismatic exterior, Archimonde harbored desires that extended far beyond his current station. He was susceptible to appeals to his vanity, instinctively impetuous when presented with opportunities for advancement. These traits would serve him well in his rise to power, but they would also prove to be the handles by which darker forces could manipulate him. The civilization of Argus continued to flourish under the guidance of its three leaders. The Eredar expanded their knowledge, refined their magics, and lived in relative harmony. It seemed as though their golden age might continue indefinitely, a testament to what a race dedicated to the pursuit of understanding could achieve. But the cosmos held dangers that even the brilliant eredar could not anticipate, forces that moved through the darkness, between stars with purposes older than worlds. And one of those forces had taken notice of Argus and its remarkable inhabitants. Before Archimonde rose to stand among the leaders of Argus, before he wore the mantle of Master of the Elgari, he was simply an apprentice. His master was a sorcerer named Thal'kiel, whose power and influence made him one of the most significant figures in eredar society. Thal'kiel led an order of mage known as the Wakeners, practitioners whose specialty lay in the summoning and binding of otherworldly entities. Thal'kiel was a sorcerer of unmatched talent. His understanding of summoning magic surpassed that of his contemporaries, and his ambitions matched his abilities. He had gathered around him a circle of loyal followers, the Wakeners, who shared his vision and his methods. Together, they explored magical territories that made many of their fellow eredar uncomfortable. Archimonde entered Thal'kiel's service as a young apprentice, eager to learn and even more eager to advance. He possessed raw talent that his master recognized and cultivated, but there was something else that Thal'kiel noticed in his pupil. Behind the dutiful exterior, behind the apparent devotion, there lurked an ambition that rivaled his own. Rumors began to circulate among the Wakeners that Archimonde coveted his master's power. Some whispered that the young apprentice was merely biding his time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to supplant Thal'kiel. But the master sorcerer dismissed these concerns. He believed in his own ability to command loyalty, and he saw in Archimonde a reflection of his younger self. This would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. During his apprenticeship, Archimonde came into contact with artifacts and energies that would shape his destiny in ways he could not yet comprehend. Among Thal'kiel's possessions were relics of considerable power, items that had been used in countless summoning rituals. One of these was a skull, an artifact that Thal'kiel kept close, believing it enhanced his connection to the entities he summoned. What neither master nor apprentice fully understood was that this skull served as a conduit for something far greater than either of them realized. A presence had begun to infiltrate Archimonde's mind, using the magical resonance of the artifact as a pathway into his consciousness. When the young eredar slept, he began to experience visions unlike any he had known before. In these dreams, Archimonde saw entire civilizations consumed by fire. He witnessed armies of impossible size sweeping across world after world, leaving nothing but ash and silence in their wake. At the head of these conquering forces stood a figure of terrible majesty, a dark god whose very presence distorted reality around him. This being whispered to Archimonde, speaking of power beyond imagination, of strength that could reshape the cosmos itself. These visions were not random. They were deliberate, a grooming process that would prepare Archimonde for what was to come. The whispers promised him everything he secretly desired: recognition, authority, and power that would dwarf anything his current position could offer. Night after night, the dreams continued, and slowly, Archimonde began to yearn for the destiny they promised. Meanwhile, Thal'kiel had grown tired of his subordinate position in eredar society. For all his power, he answered to the triumvirate of leaders who governed Argus. This arrangement had become intolerable to him. He was the greatest summoner his race had ever produced. Why should he bow to Velen's mystical pronouncements, or Kil'jaeden's intellectual posturing, or the young upstart Archimonde, who had somehow wormed his way into their ranks? In secret, Thal'kiel began to formulate a plan. Using his mastery of summoning magic, he would call forth an army of powerful demons. With this army at his command, he would overthrow the current leadership and install himself as the sole ruler of Argus. The Wakeners would become his inner circle, the foundations of a new order that would reshape Eredar civilization according to his vision. The night before Thal'kiel planned to launch his coup, Archimonde made his move. Despite the visions that had been filling his dreams, despite the whispers of the Dark God that promised him greater things, Archimonde's immediate ambition remained focused on the politics of Argus. He saw in Thal'kiel's conspiracy an opportunity that he could not afford to waste. Under cover of darkness, Archimonde slipped away from the Wakener's compound and made his way to the chambers where Velen and Kil'jaeden held council. There, he revealed everything. He told them of Thal'kiel's plan, of the demon army being prepared, of the coup that would strike the following day. And he promised them something more. He promised to deliver the traitor himself. Velen and Kil'jaeden listened carefully to this young, ambitious mage who had come to them with such explosive information. They recognized the risk he had taken, and they recognized the opportunity he was offering them. An alliance was formed in that moment, an understanding that would elevate Archimonde to new heights of power. Armed with the knowledge Archimonde had provided, the leaders of Argus moved against the Wakeners. Archimonde himself broke the magical wards that protected Thal'kiel's demon army, rendering them vulnerable to counterattack. The creatures that were supposed to conquer Argus instead found themselves hunted, destroyed by forces loyal to the triumvirate. And when the dust settled, Archimonde came face to face with his former master. Thal'kiel had been captured, his plans in ruins, his followers scattered or slain. He looked upon his apprentice with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He had never truly believed that Archimonde would betray him, had never imagined that the young mage possessed the ruthlessness to act so decisively. Archimonde drew his blade. There were no words of explanation, no attempts at justification. The betrayal was complete, and now there was only the final stroke. With a single powerful swing, Archimonde separated Thal'kiel's head from his body. The master summoner was dead, slain by the apprentice he had trained. But Archimonde was not finished. He understood something about eredar physiology that would prove crucial in the years to come. The skulls of eredar were believed to be potent conduits for magical energy, retaining power even after death. A skull properly preserved could serve as a focus for tremendous magical workings. Archimonde had Thal'kiel's skull gilded, adorned with precious metals that enhanced its magical properties. Ostensibly, this was presented as a warning, a display meant to discourage others from plotting against the leaders of Argus. But in truth, Archimonde kept the skull for himself, storing it in his private chambers where he could make use of its power. What he did not realize was that the skull would serve a purpose he had not intended. The same demonic presence that had been whispering to him through Thal'kiel's artifacts now had an even more direct conduit into his consciousness. The visions intensified. The whispers grew clearer. and Archimonde found himself increasingly drawn to the promises of the dark god who haunted his dreams. His betrayal of Thal'kiel had earned him a position among the three leaders of Argus. He stood now as an equal to Velen and Kil'jaeden, no longer a subordinate, but a ruler in his own right. Yet even as he celebrated his achievement, even as he basked in the recognition he had craved, something was changing within him. The seed had been planted, and it was only a matter of time before it bore its terrible fruit. The cosmos is vast beyond mortal comprehension, filled with wonders and horrors that defy imagination. Among the greatest powers that move through the darkness between stars are beings known as titans, entities of such immense scale and power that they shaped worlds as casually as mortals might shape clay. These titans wandered the universe, seeking order, establishing balance, and nurturing worlds that showed promise. One of these titans was named Sargeras. Once he had been the champion of the Pantheon, the council of titans who governed cosmic affairs. He had battled against the forces of chaos, defending creation from the Void Lords and the demons that plagued the great dark beyond. His sword had brought justice to countless threats, and his dedication to order was absolute. But Sargeras's endless war had shown him things that shattered his faith in the purpose he served. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. He had witnessed the Void Lord's ultimate ambition, their plan to corrupt a world soul and create a dark titan that would unmake all of existence. He had seen the inevitability of the Void's final victory if the cosmos continued on its current path. And so Sargeras had made a choice that would echo through eternity. If the Void Lords would ultimately corrupt all life, then all life must be destroyed before that could happen. Better a universe of ash and silence than a universe consumed by the void. With this terrible logic guiding him, Sargeras turned against everything he had once protected. He shattered his bonds with the Pantheon and began to forge a new force, an army that would burn away all life in a purifying flame. This army was called the Burning Legion. Sargeras gathered to him every demon he could find in the Twisting Nether, the chaotic realm between realities where such beings dwelt. He offered them purpose, direction, and the promise of endless destruction. The demons, creatures of chaos and violence by nature, eagerly accepted his leadership. They became the instrument of his apocalyptic vision, an infinite army dedicated to the annihilation of all worlds. But Sargeras recognized that demons alone, for all their power, lacked the sophistication and strategic capability needed for truly efficient conquest. He needed lieutenants, commanders who could plan and coordinate on a scale that would allow the Legion to function as a true military force rather than a mere horde. He needed beings whose intelligence matched their power. His attention fell upon Argus. The eredar had not escaped notice. Their mastery of magic, their advanced civilization, their brilliant leaders, all of these had been observed by the Dark Titan as he surveyed the cosmos for potential recruits. Here was a race that could elevate the Burning Legion beyond anything it had previously been. Here were beings worthy of standing at his side as he remade the universe. Sargeras reached out to the three leaders of Argus, appearing to them not as the destroyer he had become, but as a benevolent god offering gifts beyond measure. He spoke to each of them according to their nature, presenting himself in the guise that would be most appealing to their individual desires. To Kil'jaeden, who thirsted for knowledge, he offered answers to questions the eredar had long pondered. He promised to reveal the deepest secrets of the cosmos, the underlying principles that governed reality itself. For a mind as hungry as Kil'jaeden's, such an offer was almost impossible to refuse. To Archimonde, who craved power, Sargeras offered something different. He promised strength beyond imagination, the ability to crush worlds beneath his feet, to command armies that would make the combined forces of Argus look like children playing at war. The visions that had been filling Archimonde's dreams suddenly gained context. This was the dark god he had seen, and now that God was offering to make those visions reality. Velen received a different approach. Sargeras tried to appeal to his sense of duty, his desire to guide his people toward a greater destiny. But Velen possessed gifts that his fellow leaders did not. His sight allowed him glimpses of possible futures, and what he saw when he contemplated Sargeras' offer filled him with horror. He saw Argus burning. He saw his people transformed into monsters. He saw the universe itself consumed by fell fire. He saw the truth behind Sargeras' benevolent mask, the destroyer that lurked beneath the offers of power and knowledge. Velen tried to warn his fellow leaders. He pleaded with Kil'jaeden and Archimonde to see what he had seen, to understand the trap that was being laid for them. But they would not listen. Kil'jaeden was too entranced by the promise of knowledge, too eager to finally have the answers he had sought for so long. And Archimonde had already been prepared for this moment through years of whispered dreams and visions of conquest. Archimonde was the first of the three to accept Sargeras' offer. This was significant. Despite Kil'jaeden's obvious hunger for what the Dark Titan promised, it was Archimonde who stepped forward first, who declared his allegiance before any final decision had been made by the others. The dreams had done their work well. The seed planted through Thal'kiel's skull had blossomed into a hunger that could no longer be contained. Kil'jaeden followed shortly after, his intellectual defenses crumbling in the face of such magnificent temptation. Together, the two leaders prepared to guide their people into a new era, an age of power that would see the eredar take their rightful place among the cosmic forces. Velen refused. When it became clear that his warnings had failed, that his closest companions had chosen damnation, Velen acted with desperate speed. He gathered those few eredar who would listen, those who trusted his visions and his judgment, and through the intervention of mysterious beings of light called the Naru, Velen and his followers fled Argus. The ship that carried them across the stars became known as the Genedar. Those who traveled upon it named themselves the Draenei, which meant exiled ones in their tongue. They left behind everything they had known, their homes, their history, their world, and they left behind those who had once been their brothers. Kil'jaeden took the betrayal personally. He had viewed Velen almost as a brother, and the prophet's refusal to join them was an insult that burned like poison in his veins. From that moment forward, Kil'jaeden would dedicate himself to hunting the Draenei across the cosmos, chasing them from world to world in a vendetta that would span millennia. But Archimonde did not share this obsession. Though he had chosen Sargeras' path without hesitation, he bore Velen no particular grudge. He viewed the prophet's flight as the action of a coward beneath contempt, but not worthy of personal hatred. When Kil'jaeden raged about the Draenei and their escape, Archimonde showed little interest. He had greater concerns now, greater ambitions to pursue. The eredar who remained on Argus were transformed. The change was not merely spiritual, but physical. Their bodies twisted and grew as feel energy infused every fiber of their being. They became the Man'ari, the eredar corrupted by demonic power, and they would form the backbone of the Burning Legion's command structure. Archimonde himself changed in ways both obvious and subtle. He grew in size and power, his form taking on the aspects of a demon lord. But more than his appearance, his very nature shifted to align with the Legion's purpose. He became cruel in ways that would have shocked his former self, ruthless in the pursuit of destruction, and utterly devoted to the annihilation that Sargeras demanded. Yet even in his corruption, Archimonde retained one ambition that set him apart from many of his demonic brethren. In his heart of hearts, he did not seek merely to serve Sargeras. He sought to become a god himself, to wield powers that would rival those of the Dark Titan. This secret aspiration would drive him throughout the ages to come, pushing him to ever greater acts of conquest and destruction in pursuit of the power he craved. The golden age of Argus was over. The world that had been a beacon of knowledge and civilization became the heart of an apocalyptic crusade. And Archimonde, who had once been an ambitious young mage seeking recognition among his peers, had become the Defiler, one of the most terrible demon lords the universe would ever know. The transformation that Archimonde underwent was not merely physical, though the physical changes were dramatic enough. His form grew larger, more powerful, radiating fell energy that could be felt by any sensitive to magical currents. His skin took on the characteristic crimson hue of the Man'ari eredar, marked with the corruption that now ran through every fiber of his being. Horns sprouted from his head, testament to the demonic nature he had embraced. But the deeper changes were internal. The eredar, who had once been merely ambitious, merely power-hungry in the way that many successful beings are power-hungry, became something else entirely. The capacity for compassion that had existed within him, however small, was burned away by the fell energies that transformed him. The restraints that society and civilization had placed upon his actions were removed. He became a creature of pure purpose, and that purpose was destruction. Sargeras recognized in Archimonde a kindred spirit in some ways. Both of them had been driven by grand visions, by the belief that they understood truths that others could not grasp. Both of them had chosen paths that led away from the societies they had once served. But where Sargeras was motivated by a twisted form of cosmic philosophy, Archimonde was motivated by something simpler and perhaps more honest. He wanted power. He wanted to be the strongest, the most feared, the most magnificent being in existence. This clarity of purpose made Archimonde valuable to the Dark Titan. Kil'jaeden, for all his brilliance, was often distracted by his vendetta against Velen and the Draenei. His schemes could become overly elaborate, his patience sometimes tested by the desire for personal revenge. Archimonde had no such distractions. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it. World after world fell to his armies, not because he hated their inhabitants or wished them specific ill, but because their destruction was the mission he had been given, and he excelled at completing his missions. The first worlds to fall to Archimonde's campaigns are lost to history. They were likely primitive places, chosen specifically because they would provide easy victories that would allow the newly formed demon commander to develop his skills and strategies. The demons who served under him learned what he expected of them, learned to fear his displeasure and crave his approval. The systems of command and control that would eventually manage armies spanning the cosmos were developed in these early campaigns. As his confidence grew, so did the scale of his operations. Archimonde began to tackle more challenging targets, worlds with magical traditions capable of resisting demonic invasion, worlds whose defenders possessed genuine military capability. These campaigns provided him with opportunities to demonstrate his tactical brilliance, to develop new strategies for overcoming resistance, to refine the art of destruction to its purest form. Each victory added to his power. The fell energies released by the death of worlds fed the demons who served him, made them stronger, more numerous. The Burning Legion grew with each conquest, an ever-expanding tide of destruction that swept across the cosmos. And at the crest of that tide stood Archimonde, the Defiler, the general whose genius for war had no equal. Within the hierarchy of the Burning Legion, clear distinctions emerged based on power, cunning, and usefulness to Sargeras' grand design. At the apex stood the Dark Titan himself, the architect of universal destruction, whose will was absolute law. But immediately beneath him, two figures commanded more authority than any others. These were Kil'jaeden the Deceiver and Archimonde the Defiler, the eredar lords whose transformation had made them second only to Sargeras in the Legion's terrible pantheon. Their roles within the Legion complemented each other in ways that made the demonic army more effective than it could have been under either alone. Kil'jaeden possessed a gift for manipulation, for subtle corruption, for turning potential enemies into willing servants. He was the Legion's master of deception, working through proxies and schemes that could unfold over centuries. When the Legion wished to corrupt a world from within before the invasion began, it was Kil'jaeden who laid the groundwork. Archimonde's talents lay in a different direction. He was the military commander, the one who led the Legion's forces when open warfare was required. He possessed an innate understanding of how to deploy demonic armies for maximum effect, how to break enemy defenses, how to crush resistance with overwhelming force. Where Kil'jaeden was the whisper in the darkness, Archimonde was the hammer that shattered worlds. The Brothers in Damnation, as some called them, developed a complicated relationship. They had known each other for millennia, first as fellow leaders of Argus, and then as demon lords serving the same master. There was a bond between them, a shared history that connected them across the eons. But there was also rivalry, the constant awareness that each of them commanded enough power to threaten the other's position. At some point after the Eredar's transformation, Sargeras tasked the Legion with recruiting other powerful demon species to swell its ranks. Kil'jaeden proved particularly effective at this work, approaching various demonic races with offers they found impossible to refuse. Among his most significant recruits were the Annihilan, the beings known as Pit Lords. The Pit Lords were brutal creatures of immense size and ferocity. They were living siege engines, capable of devastating fortifications and armies with equal ease. Their kind delighted in violence and destruction, making them natural additions to the Burning Legion. They required no persuasion to join the crusade of annihilation. They simply needed direction. Though Kil'jaeden had recruited them, it was Archimonde who was placed in command of the Pit Lords. This assignment recognized his particular talents for military leadership and his ability to inspire even the most savage demons to heights of disciplined brutality. Under his guidance, the Annihilan would become one of the Legion's most feared assets. Archimonde studied his new subordinates carefully. He learned their strengths and their weaknesses, their motivations, and their fears. Among them, one pit lord stood out as particularly formidable. This creature was called Manaroth, and his bloodlust and combat prowess surpassed even the considerable standards of his race. Recognizing Manaroth's value, Archimonde made the pit lord his second in command. It was a partnership that would last for thousands of years and across countless conquered worlds. Manaroth led the Legion's ground forces into battle after battle, his massive form carving paths of destruction through enemy lines, while Archimonde directed the larger strategic picture. Archimonde's approach to leadership was characterized by both inspiration and terror. He could draw out the strength in those who served him, pushing demons to achieve feats they might not have thought possible. His presence on a battlefield galvanized the Legion's forces, filling them with a frenzied determination to destroy. But his wrath was equally motivating. Failure was often punishable by death, and those who disappointed the Defiler rarely survived long enough to disappoint him twice. The demon lords who served under Archimonde learned to walk a careful line. They competed for his favor, knowing that recognition from the Defiler could elevate their standing within the Legion. But they also feared his displeasure, understanding that his temper could flare without warning, and that his punishments were as cruel as they were final. During this period, Archimonde refined the tactics and strategies that would make the Burning Legion the most fearsome military force in existence. He developed methods for overwhelming magical defenses, for corrupting worlds from the inside before striking from without, for coordinating demon attacks across multiple fronts simultaneously. Each conquest provided new lessons, and Archimonde was an attentive student of destruction. The worlds that fell to his campaigns are too numerous to count. Some were advanced civilizations with powerful magical traditions of their own. Others were primitive societies that could offer no meaningful resistance. All of them burned in the end. All of them were reduced to lifeless husks, stripped of everything that had once made them unique and valuable. Archimonde took a particular pleasure in destroying things of beauty. When his forces encountered cities of extraordinary artistry, temples of remarkable spiritual significance, or natural wonders of profound magnificence, he made a point of ensuring their complete annihilation. It was not enough simply to conquer. He wanted to erase, to ensure that nothing remained that might remind the universe of what had been lost. This quality distinguished him from many of his fellow demons, who destroyed simply because destruction was their nature. Archimonde destroyed with purpose, with aesthetic sensibility, with a connoisseur's appreciation for the magnitude of what he was taking away. He understood what he was destroying, and he savored that understanding. Yet for all his accomplishments, for all the worlds that had fallen to his armies, Archimonde remained aware that he served another. Sargeras was the true master of the Legion, the one whose vision they all worked to fulfill. And despite his secret ambitions to rival the Dark Titan's power, Archimonde remained outwardly loyal, outwardly devoted to the cause of universal annihilation. The opportunity he sought, the chance to gain power that might elevate him beyond his current station, had not yet presented itself. But Archimonde was patient in his impatience. He knew that the cosmos was vast and full of possibilities. Somewhere out there, on some world yet to be discovered, there might exist a source of power sufficient to transform him from servant into equal. And so the Defiler continued his work, burning world after world, building his strength and his reputation with each conquest. The burning legion spread across the stars like a plague, and at the forefront of its advance stood Archimonde, the ambitious apprentice who had become a god of destruction. The methods that Archimonde developed for conquering worlds became increasingly sophisticated over time. He learned that the most efficient invasions began with psychological warfare, with demonstrations of power that broke the enemy's will before the true fighting even started. He would often have his infernals rain from the sky, massive constructs of rock and fell fire that crashed into populated areas with devastating effect. The terror these attacks inspired often did more to undermine resistance than the actual casualties they caused. He also learned the value of corrupted allies. On many worlds, there were those who could be turned to the Legion's cause through promises of power, threats of destruction, or simple weakness of character. These traitors would provide intelligence about their world's defenses, would sabotage resistance efforts, would spread despair among their own people. Archimonde did not view such beings with respect. They were tools to be used and discarded, but he recognized their utility. The demon species that served under Archimonde were varied and terrible. In addition to the pit lords who served as his shock troops, he commanded legions of fell guards, disciplined warriors who formed the backbone of his infantry forces. He deployed succubi and other corruptors to undermine enemy morale and leadership. He used fell hunters to track and destroy enemy mages, cutting off the magical support that many civilizations depended upon for defense. The infernals were perhaps his favorite weapons. These constructs could be summoned in vast numbers, raining from the sky like burning meteors to crash among enemy formations. They were not intelligent in any meaningful sense, but they were durable and relentless, and they could absorb enormous amounts of punishment, while the more valuable demon forces maneuvered into position. Archimonde developed techniques for mass infernal summoning that would later be used in his invasions of Azeroth. Throughout these campaigns, Archimonde's relationship with Kil'jaeden remained complex. The two eredar lords respected each other's abilities, even as they competed for Sargeras' favor. They worked together when necessary, combining Kil'jaeden's gift for corruption with Archimonde's military genius to bring down worlds that might have resisted either approach alone. But there was always an undercurrent of tension between them, an awareness that ultimately only one of them could be Sargeras' chief lieutenant. This rivalry never erupted into open conflict. Both Archimonde and Kil'jaeden understood that such a conflict would displease their master and might result in punishment for them both. They channeled their competitive instincts into their work, each striving to demonstrate that they were the more valuable servant. Kil'jaeden corrupted world after world with his schemes and manipulations. Archimonde conquered world after world with his armies and strategies. The competition made both of them more effective, which was perhaps exactly what Sargeras had intended. Millennia passed in this way, the Burning Legion growing ever stronger, ever more numerous, spreading across the cosmos like a cancer. Countless civilizations rose and fell, their histories erased, their achievements destroyed, their people slaughtered or corrupted into service. The universe became darker with each passing age, the light of countless suns extinguished, the potential of countless worlds snuffed out before it could be realized. And through it all, Archimonde searched for the prize that would elevate him above all others. He conquered worlds with powerful magical traditions, hoping to find artifacts or knowledge that would grant him power beyond what he already possessed. He destroyed civilizations that had achieved remarkable feats of engineering or sorcery, studying their secrets before consigning them to oblivion. He was building toward something, accumulating power and knowledge against the day when he might finally achieve the godhood he craved. That day would come on a world called Azeroth. There, beneath a tree that touched the sky, lay a source of power that could transform him into something more than he had ever been. All he had to do was reach it. All he had to do was destroy everyone who stood in his way. 10,000 years before the events that would be known as the First War, a world called Azeroth attracted the attention of the Burning Legion. This was not an ordinary world. Deep within its core slumbered a nascent titan, a world soul of tremendous potential. If this world soul were allowed to mature and awaken, it could become one of the most powerful beings in existence. More importantly for Sargeras, if the Void Lords were to corrupt it first, the Dark Titan that resulted could end all creation. Azeroth had to be destroyed. The opportunity for invasion presented itself through the actions of the world's inhabitants. On the ancient continent of Kalimdor, a race called the Kaldore, or Night Elves, had built a civilization around a vast lake of magical energy known as the Well of Eternity. This well was a font of incredible power, a wound in the world left by the Titans that connected directly to Azeroth's nascent world soul. The Night Elves' queen, Azshara, was considered the most beautiful and powerful of her people. She and her inner circle of highborn mages used the Well of Eternity for increasingly ambitious magical workings, drawing ever more deeply from its seemingly infinite power. What they did not realize was that their reckless use of such energies was sending ripples across the cosmos, signals that attracted attention from forces beyond their comprehension. Sargeras perceived these signals and recognized the opportunity they represented. The Well of Eternity could serve as a portal, a gateway through which the Burning Legion could pour into Azeroth in overwhelming numbers. He reached out to Azshara and her highborn, promising them power and glory if they would help him enter their world. Azshara, blinded by her own vanity and ambition, agreed to serve the Dark Titan. She believed that Sargeras would make her his queen, that together they would rule over a remade Azeroth. Her closest advisor, Xavius, began the work of transforming the Well of Eternity into a portal capable of admitting the Legion's forces. The invasion that followed was the largest military operation in Azeroth's history. Archimonde was given command of the Legion's ground forces, leading the assault alongside Manaroth and another powerful demon called Hakar the Houndmaster. Through the portal, beneath the well of eternity, thousands of demons poured onto the continent of Kalimdor. The devastation was immediate and overwhelming. Ancient forests burned, cities that had stood for millennia crumbled. The night elves, for all their magical power, found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered. These were not rival tribes or political opponents. These were monsters from beyond the stars, creatures of pure malevolence, whose only purpose was destruction. Archimonde reveled in the carnage. After millennia of conquering lesser worlds, he found himself facing a genuine challenge in Azeroth. The Night Elves possessed formidable magical abilities, and the world itself seemed to resist the Legion's corruption. Wild gods, demigods of nature, who had protected Azeroth for eons, rose to oppose the invasion. Ancient dragons, who had been charged by the Titans themselves, joined the defense. The resistance that formed against the Legion was led by unlikely figures. A young druid named Malfurion Stormrage emerged as one of the most significant opponents the demons faced. He represented a form of magic that the eredar had never encountered, a power drawn from nature itself rather than from arcane energies. His command of the wild forces made him a formidable opponent, even against demons who had conquered world after world. Alongside Malfurion fought his beloved, a priestess of the moon goddess Elune, named Tyrande Whisperwind. Her divine magic proved effective against the demonic invaders in ways that surprised even her. The blessing of Elune could purify the corruption that the Legion spread, could strengthen defenders beyond their normal limits, could call down strikes of moonlight that seared demon flesh. A military commander named Lord Kurtalos Ravencrest organized the Night Elf resistance, gathering what forces remained after the initial onslaught and forming them into a coherent army. He recognized that the Night Elves could not defeat the Legion through direct confrontation alone. They needed to buy time, to find some weakness in the demonic assault that could be exploited. The war that followed was brutal beyond description. For months, perhaps years, the battle raged across Kalimdor. The Legion's forces pushed ever forward, their numbers seemingly endless, while the defenders fought desperate, delaying actions. Entire regions of the continent were reduced to wastelands. Species that had existed since Azeroth's formation were hunted to extinction. Archimonde commanded the Legion's operations with tactical brilliance. He coordinated assaults across multiple fronts, keeping the defenders off balance and preventing them from concentrating their forces. He deployed his pit lords, including Manaroth, to break through Night Elf defensive lines. He sent waves of lesser demons to exhaust the resistance before committing his more powerful servants. But as the campaign progressed, Archimonde noticed something that had rarely happened in his long career of conquest. The defenders of Azeroth were not breaking. Despite the losses they suffered, despite the overwhelming odds they faced, they continued to fight. There was something about this world, something in its defenders, that refused to surrender to despair. This realization did not discourage the Defiler. If anything, it made the conquest of Azeroth more appealing. A world that could produce such stubborn resistance was a world worth destroying thoroughly. He would enjoy breaking their spirit before he burned their civilization to ash. The portal beneath the Well of Eternity continued to strengthen as the Highborn worked their dark magic. Sargeras himself prepared to enter Azeroth to personally oversee the final destruction of this troublesome world. Once the Dark Titan set foot on Azeroth, nothing would be able to prevent the Legion's victory. The stakes of the War of the Ancients extended far beyond this single world. If Azeroth fell, if the nascent Titan within was corrupted or destroyed, the consequences would ripple across the entire cosmos. The defenders who fought and died in those terrible days were fighting for more than their own survival. They were fighting for the future of everything. The Night Elf civilization that faced this invasion was unlike anything the Legion had encountered before. The Kaldore had developed a culture that blended arcane mastery with a deep connection to the natural world. Their cities were works of art as much as centers of population, designed to harmonize with the forests and mountains around them. Their magic drew upon the Well of Eternity in ways that amplified their power beyond what their individual abilities would suggest. Queen Azshara's betrayal cut through this civilization like a blade through silk. She had been the most beloved ruler in Kaldore history, a figure of such beauty and charisma that her subjects worshipped her as a living goddess. When it was revealed that she had allied with Sargeras, that she had invited the Legion to their world, the sense of betrayal was almost as devastating as the actual invasion. The Highborn, the noble caste of Night Elf society who served Azshara directly, found themselves divided. Some followed their queen into darkness, embracing the power that Sargeras offered. Others were horrified by what had happened and sought to join the resistance. The resulting schism tore apart families, ended friendships, and left scars that would persist for millennia. The common night elves, the priestesses of Elune, the druids, and the ordinary soldiers who made up the bulk of the population rallied around the resistance. They had lost their faith in their political leadership, but they had not lost their faith in each other. The war against the Legion became a war for the soul of the Kaldore people as much as a war for their survival. In the end, the Night Elves who survived the War of the Ancients would be fundamentally different from those who had existed before it. The trust they had placed in their leaders, in the stability of their society, in the safety of their world, all of it had been shattered. The civilization they would build in the war's aftermath would be more cautious, more isolated, and more suspicious of arcane magic than the one that had come before. But that was a concern for the future. In the present, they had to survive. Among the defenders of Azeroth during the War of the Ancients, few were as powerful as the beings known as the Ancients, or Wild Gods. These were demigods of nature, entities who had existed on Azeroth since the Titans first shaped the world. They represented the primal forces of the natural world, and their power was deeply rooted in the very essence of the planet they protected. Cenarius was one of the most prominent of these demigods. He was the Lord of the Forest, a being who had taught the Night Elves the first principles of Druidism. Half stag and half Night Elf in appearance, he commanded the loyalty of the wild creatures and the living forests. When the Burning Legion invaded, Cenarius was among the first to answer the call to arms. But Cenarius was not the mightiest of the wild gods. That distinction belonged to his father, a being known as Malorn the White Stag. Malorn was a creature of such age and power that even the dragons treated him with reverence. His connection to the natural order of Azeroth ran deeper than almost any other being, and his strength was legendary. Malorn had largely withdrawn from the affairs of the mortal world by the time of the Legion's invasion. He was a creature of solitude, preferring the deep forests and the quiet places where the world remained untouched. But the magnitude of the threat posed by the Burning Legion drew him forth from his seclusion. Cenarius had thrown himself into the battle against the demons with characteristic ferocity. His hatred of the unnatural corruption that the Legion represented drove him to take risks that wiser commanders might have avoided. In one engagement, Cenarius pressed his attack too aggressively, pursuing a group of demons into a trap that nearly cost him his life. The demons who had drawn Cenarius into this ambush were powerful ones, and they pressed their advantage with brutal efficiency. The demigod found himself surrounded, cut off from his allies, and facing odds that even his considerable power could not overcome. For a moment, it seemed that Cenarius would fall, that the Lord of the Forest would become another casualty of the endless war. Then Malorn arrived. The white stag burst upon the battle like a force of nature incarnate. His mere presence caused the earth to tremble and the trees to bow. He scattered the demons who had surrounded his son, buying Cenarius the time he needed to retreat to safety. But Malorn did not retreat himself. Instead, he turned to face the demonic forces, his great antlers lowered in challenge. The battle that followed drew the attention of Archimonde himself. Reports reached the Defiler of a demigod of extraordinary power who was single-handedly holding back a significant portion of the Legion's forces. Such a being could not be allowed to continue unimpeded. If Malorn could inspire this level of resistance, others might follow his example. Archimonde made his way to the battlefield, where Malorn stood against the demon horde. The Defiler had faced powerful beings before, had broken gods and demigods on countless worlds. But as he observed the white stag, he recognized that this was no ordinary opponent. Malorn radiated power in ways that Archimonde had rarely encountered. No matter. Archimonde had destroyed countless worlds. He had broken the greatest champions of 100 civilizations. He would break this one as well. The two titans of their respective forces met in combat that reshaped the landscape around them. Archimonde drew upon his fell magic, growing in size until he towered over the battlefield, his form wreathed in the corrupt energies of the Legion. Malorn stood his ground, his connection to the natural world providing him with strength that seemed to flow directly from Azeroth itself. They clashed with such force that the ground shattered beneath them. Trees were torn from their roots by the shockwaves of their blows. Lesser beings, demon and defender alike, fled from the epicenter of the battle as the two mighty figures struggled for supremacy. Malorn was fighting for his world, for his son, for everything he had known throughout his ancient existence. He channeled the power of nature itself, striking at Archimonde with forces that the demon had never faced before. The corruption of fell magic seemed to falter against the purity of Malorn's assault. But Archimonde was not merely a demon. He was one of the most powerful beings the Burning Legion had ever produced. A lieutenant of Sargeras himself, who had destroyed worlds beyond counting. He adapted to Malorn's tactics, finding ways around the demigod's defenses, pressing his advantages with ruthless precision. The battle drew on, neither combatant able to claim a decisive victory. Malorn landed blows that would have destroyed lesser demons. Archimonde's spells scorched the demigod's flesh and sapped his strength. Both of them suffered wounds that would have been fatal to almost any other being. In the end, it was Archimonde's brutal cunning that decided the contest. He feinted an attack that drew Malorn off balance, then struck with all his remaining power. His hands closed around the white stag's neck. With a terrible crack that echoed across the battlefield, Archimonde broke Malorn's neck. The demigod's body crumpled to the ground, his ancient light fading from his eyes. The white stag, father of Sargeras, one of the most powerful beings ever to walk upon Azeroth, was dead at the hands of the Defiler. The news of Malorn's death spread quickly. For the defenders of Azeroth, it was a crushing blow. If even the wild gods could fall to the Legion, what hope did mortal forces have? The despair that Archimonde had been seeking to inspire began to take hold among the resistance. But the death of Malorn had other consequences that the Defiler did not anticipate. In Azeroth's verdant dimension, known as the Emerald Dream, a being stirred who rarely roused herself to attention. Ysera, the green dragon aspect, the dreamer, opened her eyes. This was significant beyond measure. Ysera existed in a state between sleeping and waking, her consciousness drifting through the dream while her physical form rarely moved. For her to fully open her eyes and engage with the waking world was an event of profound rarity. It signified a shock to the natural order, so profound that even the dreamer could not ignore it. Meanwhile, Malfurion's storm rage arrived on the scene of Malorn's death. The young druid had grown in power throughout the war, his connection to nature deepening with each passing day. He had not been strong enough to aid Malorn in his final battle, but he was strong enough to make Archimonde pay a price for his victory. Calling upon powers that he had never before accessed, Malfurion summoned the very forests to attack the Defiler. Vines and roots erupted from the earth, wrapping around Archimonde's limbs, driving themselves into his demonic flesh. The attack was not powerful enough to destroy the demon lord, but it was powerful enough to force him to retreat. Archimonde withdrew from the battlefield, his victory marred by the unexpected counterattack. He had killed one of the greatest defenders this world had to offer, but he had also revealed to the resistance that he could be hurt, that he could be driven back. It was a tactical miscalculation that would have consequences in the battles to come. Malorn's death became a rallying cry for the defenders of Azeroth. The White Stag had given his life to save his son and to stand against the darkness. His sacrifice would not be forgotten, and those who had witnessed Archimonde's retreat knew something important. The Demon Lord was not invincible. The weeks that followed Malorn's death saw some of the most desperate fighting of the entire war. Archimonde, stung by the humiliation of being driven back by a mortal druid, redoubled his efforts to crush the resistance. He deployed forces in waves that seemed designed as much to punish the defenders for their defiance as to achieve any tactical objective. The Night Elves fought with the ferocity of those who had nothing left to lose. They had seen their greatest champion fall. They had watched their lands burn, their cities crumble, their people die in numbers that defied comprehension. And yet they continued to fight, drawing strength from the sacrifice of those who had fallen before them. The wild gods who remained rallied to the cause. Sargeras, still grieving for his father, channeled his sorrow into rage, leading attacks against the Legion that were as reckless as they were effective. Ursoc and Ursul, the Great Bear twins, threw themselves into battle after battle, their massive forms becoming rallying points for the defenders. Even Aviana, the mistress of birds, led her flocks in attacks against the flying demons that plagued the skies. The dragons, too, joined the fight in ever greater numbers. Alexstrasza, the Lifebinder, committed more and more of her red dragon flight to the defense, understanding that if Azeroth fell, there would be nothing left to protect. Ysera emerged from her eternal dream, her green dragons bringing the power of nature to bear against the Legion's corruption. Even some of the blue dragons, though their flight had been nearly destroyed by Neltharion's betrayal, joined the coalition. These combined forces managed to slow the Legion's advance, but they could not stop it. Each day brought fresh horrors, fresh casualties, fresh ground lost to the enemy. The portal beneath the Well of Eternity continued to grow stronger, and more demons poured through with each passing hour. The defenders were fighting a war of attrition that they could not win. Archimonde observed these developments with a mixture of frustration and anticipation. The resistance of Azeroth's defenders was proving more troublesome than he had expected, but he knew that their efforts were ultimately futile. They were fighting against the inevitable. Once Sargeras himself arrived, once the Dark Titan set foot upon Azeroth, no force on the planet would be able to stand against him. And when that happened, when Azeroth finally fell, Archimonde would be positioned to claim the power of the Well of Eternity for himself. The thought sustained him through the setbacks and frustrations of the campaign. Soon, very soon, everything he had worked for would be within his grasp. The War of the Ancients had reached its crisis point. The Burning Legion controlled vast swaths of Kalimdor, and the portal beneath the Well of Eternity grew stronger with each passing day. Sargeras himself was preparing to enter Azeroth, and when he did, no force on the planet would be able to resist him. The remaining defenders of Azeroth had gathered their forces for a final, desperate assault. They understood that they could not defeat the Legion through conventional military means. The demons were too numerous, too powerful, and their reinforcements were effectively infinite as long as the portal remained open. Malfurion's Stormrage had developed a plan that represented their only real hope. The Well of Eternity was the source of the Legion's portal, the conduit through which demonic forces flowed into the world. If the well could be destroyed, the portal would collapse, cutting off the Legion from its reinforcements and potentially trapping Sargeras himself between dimensions. It was a plan born of desperation, for the Well of Eternity was not merely a source of power for the Legion. It was also the foundation of Night Elf civilization, the source of their immortality and magical abilities. Destroying the well would mean sacrificing everything that the Night Elves had built, everything they had depended upon for millennia. Many among the resistance opposed this plan. They argued that there must be another way, that destroying the well would cause damage to Azeroth itself that might prove just as catastrophic as the Legion's invasion. But Malfurion understood what others did not want to accept. The choice was not between destruction and preservation. The choice was between controlled destruction on their terms and total annihilation on the Legion's terms. Tyrande Whisperwind stood by Malfurion's side, supporting his plan even as others wavered. The two of them had grown close throughout the war, their bond deepening through shared hardship and mutual devotion to their people's survival. Together, they would see this desperate strategy through to the end. The assault on the Well of Eternity was launched with every resource the Resistance could muster. Night Elf warriors, druids, priestesses, and dragon allies converged on Zinashari, the once magnificent capital city that had become the heart of the Legion's operations on Azeroth. Queen Ashara's palace stood at the edge of the well itself, and it was there that the final battle would be fought. The fighting was intense beyond description. Demons poured forth to defend the well, and the defenders threw themselves against these forces with the abandon of those who understood this was their last chance. Heroes fell by the score. The streets of Zinashari ran with blood, both mortal and demonic. Malfurion's brother, Illidan, played a crucial role in the battle that followed. Illidan had always been the more troubled of the two brothers, his hunger for power leading him down dangerous paths. During the war, he had briefly allied with the Legion before switching sides, and his motives remained unclear to many who fought alongside him. But whatever his personal demons, Illidan possessed power that proved essential in the final assault. He had obtained an artifact called the Dragon Soul, created by the 5 dragon aspects, and then corrupted by Neltharion, who had become known as Deathwing. This artifact contained tremendous power that Illidan now turned against the Legion. Using the Dragon Soul, Illidan began to reverse the flow of energy through the portal. Instead of drawing demons into Azeroth, the portal started pulling them back toward the Twisting Nether. The effect was devastating to the Legion's forces. Demons who had been on the verge of overwhelming the defenders suddenly found themselves being sucked backward toward the dimensional rift. Monaroth, Archimonde's second-in-command, was caught in this reversal. The Pit Lord fought against the pull with all his considerable strength, but even he could not resist the power of the Dragon Soul forever. He was drawn back into the Nether, his roar of rage echoing across the battlefield as he vanished. But the Dragon Soul's power came at a cost. The energy being channeled through the portal destabilized the Well of Eternity itself. The vast lake of magical energy began to collapse in on itself, its structure breaking down under forces it was never meant to contain. Sargeras, who had been on the verge of entering Azeroth physically, found himself facing a collapsing gateway. The Dark Titan reached through the failing portal, his immense form partially visible to the defenders below. For a terrible moment, it seemed that he might force his way through despite everything, that his will alone might overcome the destruction of the well. But the collapse was too complete, too total. The portal imploded with a force that shook the very foundations of the world. Sargeras was forcibly ejected back into the Nether, his attempt to enter Azeroth thwarted at the last possible moment. The implosion of this Well of Eternity triggered a catastrophe that would reshape Azeroth forever. The energy released was so vast that it tore the continent of Kalimdor apart. The ancient supercontinent shattered into multiple smaller landmasses, separated by vast oceans that poured into the wounds left by the destruction. This event became known as the Sundering, and it was the most devastating cataclysm in Azeroth's history. Millions died as the land itself broke apart beneath them. Entire civilizations vanished in moments. The world that emerged from the Sundering was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before, its geography permanently altered by the power that had been unleashed. At the center of the destruction, where the Well of Eternity had once been, a permanent storm of chaotic energy formed. This was the Maelstrom, a swirling vortex that would endure for millennia, a constant reminder of what had been lost and what had been sacrificed to save the world. Archimonde and the surviving demons were caught in the collapse of the portal. The Defiler, who had been directing the Legion's operations from a position of relative safety, found himself suddenly severed from the physical world. The gateway that had allowed the demons to maintain their presence on Azeroth was gone, and without it, they had no anchor to keep them there. The Twisting Nether reclaimed them all. Archimonde, Monaroth, and countless lesser demons were drawn back into the chaotic realm between realities. Their invasion had been stopped, their victory denied at the very moment when it had seemed assured. For Archimonde, this defeat was unprecedented. He had never been turned back from a conquest before. He had never experienced failure on this scale. The rage that filled him was vast and terrible, a fury that would burn for 10,000 years as he waited for another chance at the world that had dared to resist him. The defenders of Azeroth had won, but their victory had come at an almost unimaginable cost. The Night Elves had lost their immortality when the well was destroyed. Their civilization lay in ruins, scattered across the broken fragments of what had once been their homeland. They would spend generations rebuilding, and they would never forget the price they had paid. But they had survived. Against the full might of the Burning Legion, against Archimonde and Monaroth and Sargeras himself, they had survived. And in that survival lay hope for the future, hope that when the Legion inevitably returned, the people of Azeroth would find a way to stop them once again. In the aftermath of the Sundering, the survivors of Azeroth began the long work of rebuilding. The Night Elves, led by Malfurion and Tyrande, established a new civilization in the forests of northern Kalimdor. They had learned bitter lessons from the war, particularly about the dangers of uncontrolled magical power. Malfurion championed a return to Druidism and the veneration of nature, while Tyrande led the Sentinels, a military force dedicated to protecting their people from threats both internal and external. A decision was made to plant a new world tree, one that would serve as a monument to those who had fallen and a symbol of hope for the future. This tree, called Nordrassil, was planted atop Mount Kil'jaeden, at the site where Archimonde would eventually meet his first defeat. The dragon aspects blessed the tree with powerful enchantments. Nosdormu granted it a connection to the Timeways. Ysera linked it to the Emerald Dream, and Alexstrasza gave it vitality and growth that would allow it to flourish for millennia. But hidden beneath Nordrassil's roots was a secret. Illidan's storm rage, despite everything that had happened, had managed to save vials of water from the Well of Eternity before its destruction. He poured these vials into a lake at the summit of Mount Kil'jaeden, creating a second well that would serve as a source of magical power for the New World Tree. This act was discovered and condemned by his fellow Night Elves. Illidan was imprisoned for his crime, locked away beneath Mount Kil'jaeden, where he would remain for 10,000 years. The creation of this new well was significant for reasons that extended beyond Night Elf society. Its existence meant that the power Archimonde had sought, the power that could elevate him to godhood, still existed on Azeroth. It was protected by the World Tree and the dragon enchantments, but it was there, waiting, and somewhere in the Twisting Nether, the Defiler knew it. The Night Elves did not realize the full implications of what they had done. They believed the war was over, that the Legion had been defeated, that they were safe. They withdrew from the wider world, isolating themselves in their forests and their dreaming. They did not know that their victory had been temporary, that the demons they had banished would return, that the power they had preserved would once again attract the attention of those who craved it. Across the cosmos, Archimonde raged. 10,000 years in the Twisting Nether gave him ample time to contemplate his failure, to analyze what had gone wrong, to plan for the day when he would return. The defeat at Azeroth was not merely a setback, it was a humiliation, a stain on his record of conquest that demanded redress. He replayed the campaign in his mind countless times, identifying the mistakes he had made, the opportunities so he had missed. He had underestimated the defenders of Azeroth, had not taken seriously enough the power of their wild gods and dragons. He had allowed himself to become distracted by the killing of Malorn when he should have been focused on the larger strategic picture. He had not anticipated that his enemies would be willing to destroy their own source of power rather than see it fall into his hands. These lessons would inform his approach when he finally returned. He would not make the same mistakes twice, would bring overwhelming force and leave nothing to chance. He would crush any resistance before it could organize, and he would claim the power of the Well of Eternity before his enemies had a chance to deny it to him again. But first, he had to find a way back to Azeroth. The Sundering had disrupted the magical connections that the Legion had used to reach the world. The portal beneath the well was gone, destroyed along with the well itself. Creating a new gateway would require tremendous magical power and specific conditions that might take centuries or millennia to arrange. Archimonde was patient. He had been patient before, waiting in the Nether while Kil'jaeden's schemes slowly corrupted the orcs of Draenor. He would be patient again, and when the time was right, when the opportunity presented itself, he would return to Azeroth and complete what he had started. 10,000 years passed in the mortal world, while Archimonde raged in the Twisting Nether. 10,000 years of waiting, of planning, of nursing his hatred for the world that had denied him victory. For a demon of his power, time moved differently, but even he felt the weight of millennia as he contemplated his revenge. The Burning Legion did not remain idle during this period. Sargeras and his lieutenants continued their work across the cosmos, destroying other worlds and building the forces that would eventually return to finish what they had started on Azeroth. But the memory of their defeat remained, a wound in their collective pride that demanded healing. Kil'jaeden took a particular interest in the problem of Azeroth. His methods were more subtle than Archimonde's direct assaults, and he believed that the key to conquering this stubborn world lay in corrupting its defenders from within. If the people of Azeroth could be turned against each other, if their unity could be shattered before the invasion began, then the next attempt would succeed where the first had failed. His attention fell upon the orcs of Draenor, a world that had become home to the Draenei who had fled Argus so long ago. Kil'jaeden's ancient vendetta against Velen's followers, could be served alongside his plans for Azeroth, a combination that appealed to his sense of efficiency. Through manipulation and corruption, Kil'jaeden transformed the once peaceful orcs into a savage horde devoted to destruction. He used Manaroth's blood to bind them to the Legion, creating a fell curse that would enslave their race to demonic will. When the time was right, he opened a portal between Draenor and Azeroth, sending the orcish horde to begin the work of conquest. This was the first war, and it marked the beginning of a new chapter in Azeroth's struggle against the Burning Legion. The kingdom of Stormwind fell to the horde's assault, its survivors fleeing north to the other human nations. The Second War followed, as the united forces of the Alliance of Lordaeron drove the orcs back and eventually destroyed the dark portal that connected the two worlds. But these were merely preliminary moves in a larger game. Kil'jaeden's true plan extended far beyond the orc invasions. He had found a way to create an advance force that would prepare Azeroth for the Legion's return, a force that could operate independent of portals and interdimensional gateways. This force was the Scourge, an army of undead bound to a single will. Kil'jaeden transformed a shaman named Ner'zhul into the Lich King, a disembodied spirit of immense power whose consciousness was imprisoned within a suit of armor frozen in the continent of Northrend. From there, the Lich King would spread a plague of undeath across the land, raising armies of the dead that would soften Azeroth's defenses for the Legion's arrival. The plan exceeded Kil'jaeden's expectations. The Scourge swept across the human kingdom of Lordaeron with terrifying speed, killing thousands and raising them as undead servants. Prince Arthas Menethil, heir to the throne of Lord Aeron, pursued the Scourge to Northrend, and there fell to the Lich King's corruption. The young prince became a Death Knight, one of the most powerful servants of the undead, and he returned to his homeland to complete its destruction. Arthas murdered his own father, King Tyrannus, and led the Scourge in conquering all of Lordaeron. The other human nations were thrown into chaos. The alliance that had united against the orcs found itself facing a new threat, one that turned their own fallen against them. And through it all, Archimonde waited. He watched the events unfolding on Azeroth through demonic channels, observed the success of the Scourge's campaign, and prepared for the moment when he would finally set foot on that world again. The summoning that would bring Archimonde to Azeroth required enormous magical power. His strength had grown exponentially since the War of the Ancients, and the energies needed to manifest his physical form in the mortal world exceeded what most rituals could provide. But there was an artifact that could serve this purpose, a tome of incredible magical knowledge that had been created by one of the most powerful mages ever to walk Azeroth. This was the Book of Medivh, written by the last guardian of Tirisfal. Medivh had been a mage of unprecedented power, but he had been corrupted before birth by the spirit of Sargeras himself. Through Medivh, Sargeras had first opened the dark portal, bringing the orcs to Azeroth. Though Medivh had been killed and the corruption purged from his spirit, the Book of Medivh remained, containing knowledge of dimensional magic that could pierce the barriers between worlds. Kel'Thuzad, a human mage who had joined the cult of the damned and been killed in service to the Scourge, had been resurrected as a lich through the power of the Sunwell in Quel'Thalas. Now he stood ready to perform the ritual that would bring Archimonde to Azeroth. All that remained was obtaining the Book of Medivh. The book was kept in Dalaran, the city of mages that had stood for centuries as a center of magical learning. The Kirin Tor, the Council of Archmage who governed Dalaran, protected the book and many other dangerous artifacts within their vaults. They had long known that the book posed a threat if it fell into the wrong hands. They were about to learn just how right they were. The Kirin Tor had watched the fall of Lordaeron with growing alarm. The undead plague that swept through the northern kingdom represented a threat unlike any they had faced before. Unlike conventional armies, the scourge grew stronger with each battle, its victims rising to join the ranks of the enemy. Unlike magical threats, the plague could spread through mundane means, contaminating grain supplies and water sources. Antonidas had ordered preparations to be made. The magical wards protecting Dalaran were strengthened. The most dangerous artifacts in the city's vaults were either secured more thoroughly or moved to hidden locations. Mages with expertise in holy magic and purification were brought in to develop countermeasures against the undead. It was a comprehensive response to an unprecedented threat. But the Kirin Tor, for all their magical knowledge, had underestimated the nature of their enemy. They had prepared for undead hordes attacking their walls. They had not prepared for a strike force led by a death knight and a lich, supported by demons and equipped with insider knowledge of Dalaran's defenses. Arthas Menethil had once been a paladin, a champion of the light who had trained alongside some of the greatest heroes of the Alliance. He had visited Dalaran multiple times during his life, attending diplomatic functions and consulting with the Kirin Tor on matters of magical threat. He knew the city's layout, knew its strengths and weaknesses, knew the personality quirks of its leaders. All of this knowledge was now turned against his former allies. Kel'Thuzad, too, had once been a member of the Kirin Tor. He had been expelled for his experiments with necromancy, deemed too dangerous to be allowed to continue. But before his expulsion, he had spent decades studying in Dalaran's libraries, working in its laboratories, walking its streets. He knew secrets about the city that even many current members did not. Together, these two former defenders of light had become instruments of the Legion's will. They would tear down everything they had once protected, and they would do it with an efficiency that only intimate knowledge could provide. The city of Dalaran had stood for centuries as a testament to human magical achievement. Its violet spires rose above the hills, visible for miles in every direction. Within its walls, mages studied the mysteries of the arcane, developing spells and theories that advanced the understanding of magic throughout the eastern kingdoms. The Kirin Tor, the ruling council of Archmage, governed the city with wisdom accumulated over generations. Among them, Antonidas was the most respected, a mage of tremendous power and greater wisdom who had guided Dalaran through some of its most difficult periods. When word came of the undead plague spreading through Lordaeron, Antonidas had taken precautions to protect his city. He could not have known that those precautions would prove insufficient. Arthas Menethil, now fully corrupted as a death knight, led the Scourge's assault on Dalaran. Beside him stood Kel'Thuzad, the lich whose resurrection had been accomplished at such terrible cost. Together, they commanded forces that had already conquered an entire kingdom. The mages of Dalaran had prepared magical wards specifically designed to harm any undead that entered their city. These protections represented some of the most sophisticated defensive magic ever created, drawing on centuries of research and the combined talents of the greatest minds in the Kirin Tor. Kel'Thuzad detected the nature of these wards and reported his findings to Arthas. The auras causing damage to the Scourge would dissipate when their casters were killed. This gave the attackers a clear objective. If they could eliminate the mages maintaining the wards, the defenses would fall. The assault on Dalaran was methodical and brutal. Scourge forces pressed into the city from multiple directions, engaging the defenders while assassination squads hunted down the mages responsible for the protective enchantments. Simultaneously, other undead forces broke open the Violet Hold, the magical prison beneath Dalaran, releasing the dangerous creatures held within. The defenders found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, their carefully prepared defenses being dismantled piece by piece. Each wizard who fell meant one less ward protecting the city. Each creature released from the Violet Hold meant one more threat that had to be addressed. Antonidas himself made a final stand in the vault where the Book of Medivh was kept. The ancient archmage faced Arthas, Kel'Thuzad, and the dreadlord Tichondrius with the full power at his command. It was a battle that shook the foundations of the tower, a confrontation between one of humanity's greatest mages and the forces of undeath. In the end, even Antonidas's power was not enough. The archmage fell, and the Book of Medivh passed into the hands of the Scourge. Tichondrius took the skull of Gul'dan, another artifact of significant power, while Kel'Thuzad claimed the book that would enable Archimonde's summoning. With the book secured, the Scourge forces withdrew from Dalaran. They made their way to a hilltop outside the city, a location that would serve as the site of the summoning ritual. Arthas stood guard, while Kel'Thuzad began the lengthy process of opening a portal powerful enough to bring Archimonde to Azeroth. The ritual drew upon forces that warped reality around the hilltop. The sky above began to change, taking on colors that belonged to no natural phenomenon. Mages from Dalaran who had survived the assault attempted to intervene, but Arthas and the Scourge forces cut them down before they could disrupt the ceremony. As the ritual progressed, demons began to emerge from the forming rift. Lesser creatures at first, fellhounds and infernals that reinforced the Scourge's defensive perimeter. Then more powerful entities, dreadlords and felguards, who took their positions around the ritual site. And finally, the greatest of the summoned demons, the pit lords Manaroth and Kazak themselves. The portal stabilized, its surface shimmering with energies that hurt to look upon. And through it stepped Archimonde the Defiler. 10,000 years had passed since he had last walked upon Azeroth. 10,000 years of waiting, of planning, of nursing his rage. Now he was here again, and he intended to finish what he had started. Archimonde's first act upon arriving was to make an example of what would happen to those who resisted the Legion. He turned his attention to Dalaran, the city that had housed the book used to summon him, the city whose mages had tried to prevent his arrival. What followed was a display of power that would be remembered for generations. Archimonde did not assault Dalaran with armies. He did not send demons to burn its towers or undead to slaughter its people. Instead, he walked to a position where he could view the city clearly and he began to work magic on a scale that few had ever witnessed. He traced symbols in the air with his hands, fell energy flowing from his fingers to form complex diagrams that hung suspended before him. These were not ordinary runes or glyphs. They were representations of Dalaran's very structure, a magical map of the city's foundations and supports. With the diagram complete, Archimonde reached down and gathered sand from the ground beneath his feet. He sprinkled this sand across the diagram, and as he did so, a miniature replica of Dalaran rose from the earth before him. Every tower was represented, so every wall, every building. Then, slowly and deliberately, Archimonde reached toward the sand model. He grasped one of the tiny towers and crushed it between his fingers. In the distance, the corresponding tower in the real Dalaran crumbled and fell. The demon lord continued his work, methodically destroying the sand replica piece by piece. With each structure he crushed, the actual building in Dalaran collapsed. Towers that had stood for centuries toppled in moments. Walls that had withstood siege after siege crumbled to dust. The great violet spire that had been the symbol of Dalaran's power shattered and fell. Within minutes, the great city of mages was nothing but rubble. Archimonde had destroyed it single-handedly, without ever setting foot within its walls. It was a demonstration of power that made clear what awaited any who dared oppose the burning legion. Archimonde turned to face the forces gathered around him, the demons and undead who would serve as the vanguard of the new invasion. His voice carried across the assembled host with supernatural clarity. Let the echoes of doom resound across this wretched world, that all who live may hear them and despair. The invasion of Azeroth had begun again. The destruction of Dalaran sent shockwaves across the eastern kingdoms. The mage city had been a symbol of human magical achievement, a beacon of knowledge and power that had stood for centuries. Its fall demonstrated that even the most protected, most magically advanced city in the human kingdoms was not safe from the Legion's wrath. Survivors of the siege carried tales of what had happened to every corner of Azeroth. They spoke of the undead hordes that had overwhelmed the city's defenses, of the Death Knight who had once been their beloved prince, of the Lich who had once been one of their own mages. And they spoke of the demon who had appeared at the end, the massive figure who had destroyed their city with a mere gesture. Archimonde's display of power was deliberate. He wanted the people of Azeroth to know what they faced, to understand that resistance was futile. He wanted them to despair, to give up before the fighting even started. Fear was a weapon, and Archimonde knew how to wield it. The tactic worked to some extent. Many who heard the tales of Dalaran's destruction lost hope. They fled their homes, seeking refuge in remote areas where they might escape notice. Some committed suicide rather than face what was coming. Others turned to dark powers themselves, hoping to curry favor with the demons before the end came. But not everyone gave in to despair. There were those who heard the tales and felt not fear, but determination. They understood that the Legion represented an existential threat, that there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The only chance for survival lay in standing and fighting, no matter how hopeless it seemed. These were the ones who would eventually gather at Mount Hyjal. They were the survivors, the stubborn, the brave. They came from every race and every walk of life, united by nothing except their refusal to accept extinction. And together, they would defy the Defiler one final time. With Dalaran destroyed and the portal to the Twisting Nether stable, the Burning Legion's forces began pouring into Azeroth in ever-increasing numbers. Archimonde wasted no time in reorganizing the command structure of the invasion to suit his purposes. His first act was to place the Dreadlord Tichondrius in command of the Scourge. This was a significant change. The Scourge had been created and controlled by the Lich King, but Archimonde had no interest in allowing an independent power to operate within his invasion force. By placing Tichondrius in command, he effectively removed the Lich King from direct control of the undead armies. The Lich King would not forget this slight. In his frozen prison in Northrend, the entity that had once been Ner'zhul seethed with resentment. He had served the Legion faithfully, had created the plague that broke Lordaeron, had corrupted Arthas to serve as his champion. And now he found himself sidelined, his scourge taken from him and given to a dreadlord who answered only to Archimonde. This resentment would eventually lead the Lich King to rebel against the Legion, but that was a problem for another time. For now, Archimonde had more pressing concerns. The invasion of Lordaeron continued at an accelerated pace. With the Scourge and demonic forces working in concert, the remaining pockets of resistance were systematically eliminated. The other human kingdoms watched in horror as reports came in of the devastation, but they were too divided and too weakened by their own problems to mount any effective response. Archimonde, Manaroth, and Tichondrius developed a plan to deal with another potential threat. The orcs who had once served the Legion had broken free of their demonic corruption. Under the leadership of War Chief Thrall, they had established a new horde dedicated to honor rather than destruction. These orcs could potentially complicate the invasion if they chose to oppose the Legion. The plan they developed was elegant in its cruelty. Manaroth's blood had originally corrupted the orcs, binding them to demonic will. If the orcs could be made to drink demon blood again, they would fall back under Legion control. All that was needed was a way to tempt them into corruption. The Night Elves of Kalimdor provided the key. Cenarius, the demigod who had fought against the Legion during the War of the Ancients, still lived in the forests of Kalimdor. If the orcs could be manipulated into conflict with Cenarius, their desperation might drive them to seek any power that could help them survive. Events unfolded largely according to plan. Thrall had led the horde across the sea to Kalimdor, seeking a new homeland far from the conflicts of the eastern kingdoms. But the Night Elves viewed these newcomers as invaders, and Cenarius himself emerged to drive them from his forests. Grom Hellscream, one of Thrall's most trusted warriors, led his Warsong clan in battle against Cenarius. But the demigod was too powerful, his command of nature magic too overwhelming. The orcs faced annihilation at the hands of a being they could not defeat through conventional means. Manaroth appeared at their darkest hour, offering the power they needed. All they had to do was drink from the pool of fell blood he had prepared. Hellscream, desperate to save his warriors and driven by his own pride, made the choice. He drank, and his clan drank with him. The corruption returned to the Warsong orcs. Their skin took on a green hue, their eyes glowed with fell fire, and their strength multiplied beyond natural limits. With this new power, they attacked Cenarius again, and this time the demigod fell. The death of Cenarius was a blow to the defenders of Azeroth, but it was not the complete victory the Legion had hoped for. Thrall and the rest of the Horde had not drunk the demon blood, and even the Warsong orcs, despite their corruption, retained some measure of their own will. Hellscream's reaction to what he had done was not what Manaroth expected. Instead of embracing the Legion's power, the warrior was filled with shame and rage at having fallen again to corruption. When Manaroth revealed himself to claim his new servants, Hellscream attacked. The battle between Hellscream and Manaroth was fierce and desperate. Thrall had come to aid his friend, and together the two orcs faced the Pit Lord. In the end, Hellscream struck the blow that killed Manaroth, but the Pit Lord's death released an explosion of fell energy that killed Hellscream as well. The death of Manaroth broke the blood, curse that had bound the orcs to the Legion. All orcs everywhere, not just the Warsong, found themselves freed from the last vestiges of demonic corruption. It was a blow to Archimonde's plans, but only a temporary setback. The Legion's true objective lay elsewhere. Archimonde had come to Azeroth not merely to conquer its nations or enslave its peoples. He had come for what lay beneath the world tree Nordrassil, the second well of eternity. 10,000 years ago, the destruction of the original well had denied him his prize. But the Night Elves had created a new well, hidden beneath their world tree on the slopes of Mount Kil'jaeden. If Archimonde could drain this well's power, he could achieve his ultimate goal. He could become a god, wielding power that would rival Sargeras himself. The march to Kalimdor began. The Legion's forces moved across the sea, following the paths that the mortal refugees from Lordaeron had taken. They would find the World Tree. They would break its defenders. And Archimonde would claim what had been denied to him for 10,000 years. The crossing was not without challenges. The seas of Azeroth were vast, and even the Legion's portals had limitations. Moving an army across an ocean required considerable logistical coordination, the kind of planning that Archimonde had perfected over millennia of conquest. Demonic vessels materialized from the Twisting Nether, ships that sailed on currents of fell energy rather than wind and wave. Infernals were launched across the waters like living artillery, crashing down on Kalimdor's eastern shores to establish beachheads for the main force. Dreadlords flew ahead, scouting the terrain and identifying potential resistance. The native inhabitants of Kalimdor watched the approaching storm with growing alarm. Word of the destruction in the eastern kingdoms had spread, carried by the refugees who had fled across the sea. They knew that something terrible was coming, even if they did not fully understand its nature. The Tauren of the Barrens had been dealing with their own problems, harried by centaur raiders and struggling to maintain their nomadic way of life. But when they saw the green fire on the eastern horizon, when they felt the ground tremble beneath demonic feet, they understood that their petty conflicts had become irrelevant. The Night Elves had detected the Legion's approach through their druidic networks, sensing the corruption that preceded Archimonde's forces like the stench before a plague. They had hoped that the sea would provide protection, that the Legion would be content with the eastern kingdoms and leave Kalimdor alone. Those hopes had proven futile, and the orcs, the Tauren, and the humans who had fled to this continent found themselves trapped. They had come to Kalimdor seeking escape from the Scourge and the Legion. Now the Legion had followed them. There was nowhere left to run. the mortal races of Azeroth found themselves facing extinction. The Scourge and the Burning Legion had swept across the eastern kingdoms, destroying the kingdom of Lordaeron and scattering the survivors. Now the demons had crossed to Kalimdor, pursuing the refugees who had fled there, and the World Tree itself was under threat. In this darkest hour, an unlikely alliance began to form. The driving force behind this alliance was a mysterious prophet who appeared to the leaders of the various factions, warning them of the danger they faced and urging them to unite against the common enemy. This prophet was Medivh, the last guardian of Tirisfal, who had been possessed by Sargeras and had opened the dark portal decades ago. Medivh had been killed, but his spirit had been preserved and purified. Now he walked the world again, seeking to atone for the damage he had caused by helping to stop the Legion's invasion. Medivh approached Jaina Proudmoore, a powerful mage who led the survivors of Lordaeron. He convinced her to take her, people across the sea, to Kalimdor, promising that salvation awaited them there. It was a leap of faith for Jaina, but she recognized the wisdom in the prophet's words. He also approached Thrall, the war chief of the Horde. Though the orcs had reason to distrust any human, even a mystical one, Thrall listened to Medivh's warnings. He too led his people to Kalimdor, seeking the destiny the prophet promised. And finally, Medivh came to the Night Elves, the race that had faced the Legion 10,000 years ago and turned back its invasion. He warned Tyrande and Malfurion of what was coming, of the threat to their world tree and everything they had built since the Sundering. The Night Elves had withdrawn from the other races, isolating themselves in their forests, but they could not ignore this threat. The three factions met in the forests of Ashenvale. The meeting was tense. Humans and orcs had been at war for decades. Night Elves viewed both as invaders in their lands. Old hatreds and suspicions threatened to undermine any cooperation before it could begin. But Medivh's words carried weight, and the evidence of the Legion's approach was undeniable. Demons had been spotted in the forests. Undead forces were marching from the east. The sky itself seemed to darken with the approach of what was coming. An alliance was formed. It was not based on trust or friendship, but on the shared understanding that survival required cooperation. Jaina Proudmoore, Thrall, Tyrande Whisperwind, and Malfurion Stormrage would lead their peoples in the defense of Mount Hyjal. The negotiations that led to this alliance were tense and often contentious. The humans blamed the orcs for the destruction that had swept across Lordaeron, forgetting for a moment that the orcs under Thrall had played no part in the Scourge's campaign. The orcs distrusted the humans, remembering the internment camps where their people had languished after the Second War. The Night Elves viewed both as invaders in their lands, foreign races who had brought war and destruction to Kalimdor. Medivh worked tirelessly to overcome these barriers. He reminded the humans that the orcs had broken free of demonic control, that Thrall's horde was fundamentally different from the one that had ravaged their lands a generation ago. He reminded the orcs that the humans had also suffered at the hands of the Legion and its servants, that they were victims as much as any orc who had been corrupted by Monaroth's blood. He reminded the Night Elves that isolation had not protected them before, that the Legion had invaded 10,000 years ago when the Kaldorei stood alone, and that this time would be no different unless they accepted help. Slowly, grudgingly, the factions came together. They established protocols for cooperation, designated commanders for different aspects of the defense, allocated resources and responsibilities. It was an imperfect alliance, held together by necessity rather than genuine trust, but it was an alliance nonetheless. Jaina Proudmoore proved herself an invaluable diplomat during these negotiations. She had the magical power to command respect among the night elves, the political standing to represent humanity, and the personal courage to advocate for peace with the orcs despite everything her people had suffered. Her friendship with Thrall, forged during their journey to Kalimdor, provided a foundation upon which the broader alliance could be built. Thrall brought his own strengths to the table. He was a warrior who had earned the respect of his people through combat, but he was also an orc who had been raised among humans, who understood both cultures in ways that few others could. He could speak to human concerns in ways that resonated with them while maintaining the respect of his orcish followers. Tyrande and Malfurion carried the weight of 10,000 years of history. They had fought the Legion before, had seen what these demons could do when they were allowed to run unchecked. Their experience gave the Alliance a strategic depth that it would not otherwise have had. They knew the enemy's tactics, understood their strengths and weaknesses, and could anticipate many of their moves. The plan they developed recognized a fundamental truth about their situation. They could not defeat the Legion in direct combat. The demons were too numerous, too powerful, and their numbers would only grow as more poured through the portals. Any defensive position would eventually be overwhelmed. What they could do was buy time. Malfurion had conceived a desperate strategy, one that echoed what had been done during the War of the Ancients. The world tree Nordrassil was not merely a tree. It was the focus of enchantments placed by the dragon aspects themselves, blessings that had granted the night elves their immortality and protected the well of eternity that lay beneath its roots. Those enchantments could be weaponized. If they were ignited at precisely the right moment, they could destroy even a being as powerful as Archimonde. But the process would take time, and someone would have to hold the demons at bay while Malfurion and his druids completed their work. The defenders established 3 defensive positions along the slopes of Mount Hyjal. Each position was designed to delay the Legion's advance, to buy precious time for the ritual to be completed. The first line was held by Jaina Proudmoore and the human survivors. They constructed fortifications at the mountain's base, preparing to face the initial onslaught of the Legion's forces. Jaina knew that her position would eventually fall, but she was determined to make the demons pay for every inch of ground. The second line was held by Thrall and the Horde. Orcs, Tauren, and Trolls had constructed defenses higher up the mountain, with goblin-crafted landmines supplementing their more conventional fortifications. Thrall understood that the orcs had a particular debt to pay. Their corruption by the Legion had caused so much suffering. Now they would stand against the demons and prove that their honor had been restored. The third and final line was held by the night elves themselves. Tyrande commanded the sentinels, Malfurion guided the druids, and the ancient trees of Nordrassil's forests rose to defend their home. This line would hold until the end, until the ritual was complete, or all hope was lost. Other forces joined the defense. The Shadowtooth clan of dark trolls, natives of Mount Hejal, who had long avoided contact with outsiders, emerged to fight alongside the other defenders. Furbolg tribes who lived in the mountains' forests added their strength. Even some of the surviving dragons, descendants of those who had fought in the War of the Ancients, came to stand against the Legion. It was the greatest gathering of Azeroth's defenders since the Sundering. Races that had been enemies for generations stood shoulder to shoulder, united by the knowledge that their world hung in the balance. If they failed here, there would be no second chance. Archimonde observed the preparations of the defenders from a distance. He had waited 10,000 years for this moment. He could afford to take a few more hours to savor what was about to happen. Let them build their walls, he thought. Let them sharpen their swords and prepare their spells. It would make no difference. He had destroyed civilizations beyond counting. He had broken the mightiest champions of 100 worlds. These mortals were no different. Soon, very soon, he would drain the power of the well of eternity. He would become what he had always been destined to become, and no force in the universe would be able to stop him. The battle began at dawn. Archimonde had assigned 3 of his most powerful lieutenants to lead the assault on the defensive positions. Rage Winterchill, a lich of tremendous power, would attack the human line. Netheron, a dreadlord whose cunning matched his ferocity, would assault the Horde's position. And Asgalor, a pit lord who had served Archimonde since the War of the Ancients, would break the Night Elf defenses. The Defiler himself would not participate in these preliminary engagements. He would wait until the path to the World Tree was clear, then ascend to claim his prize. Let his servants do the work of breaking the defenders. He had more important matters to attend to. Rage Winterchill's forces struck Jaina's line first. Waves of undead poured up the mountain, supported by demons who rained fire from the skies. The human defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that every minute they held was another minute for Malfurion's ritual to progress. Jaina Proudmoore proved herself a commander of exceptional ability. She coordinated her forces brilliantly, using her own considerable magical power to strike at key moments in the enemy assault. When undead broke through the walls, she was there to incinerate them with blizzards of ice. When demons threatened to overwhelm a position, her arcane missiles drove them back, but the numbers were against her. For every demon that fell, 2 more took its place. For every undead destroyed, the corpses of her own fallen soldiers rose to join the enemy ranks. The defensive line contracted, then broke. Jaina made the decision to retreat while she still could. She gathered the survivors of her force and teleported them to safety, preserving what remained of her army for future battles. The first line had fallen, but it had held for hours longer than anyone had expected. Thrall and the Horde faced a Netheron's assault next. The Dreadlord had learned from watching Rage Winterchill's attack, and he adapted his tactics accordingly. Instead of simply overwhelming the defenders with numbers, he sent infiltrators to disable the goblin landmines that protected key positions. The fighting at the Horde's line was even more intense than at the first position. Orcs and Tauren threw themselves against the demonic forces with a fury born of generations of suffering at the Legion's hands. Trolls fought with the reckless courage of those who had nothing left to lose. Among the Horde's warriors, Some distinguished themselves with acts of valor that would be remembered for generations. One orc warrior named Broxagar held a critical pass against overwhelming numbers, his axe rising and falling in endless rhythm as he cut down demon after demon. When his position was finally overrun, Broxagar was the only survivor, his legendary stand having bought precious time for the rest of the line. Thrall himself faced a Netheron in single combat at one point during the battle. The Dreadlord's dark magic clashed with the warchief's shamanistic powers, and for a moment it seemed that Thrall might fall. But the elements of Azeroth answered his call, and a Netheron was forced to withdraw. In the end, however, the second line fell as well. Thrall ordered a retreat to the Night Elf position, consolidating what remained of the Horde's forces with those of their allies. They had held for longer than the humans, but the outcome was the same. The Night Elves faced the full might of the remaining Legion forces. Asgalor led the assault, his massive form visible across the battlefield as he carved through defensive positions. The Pit Lord's weapon, a terrible blade called Spite, radiated an aura of despair that sapped the courage of those who faced it. During the battle, Asgalor struck down a druid named Brawl Baremantle's daughter, Anessa. The idol of Remulos, an artifact Brawl had been using to empower the defenders, was corrupted by the blow. It was a devastating personal loss amid the larger carnage of the battle. The Night Elf line began to buckle under the assault. For the first time since the battle began, it seemed that the defenders might break before Malfurion's ritual was complete. If the demons reached the World Tree before the enchantments were ready, everything would be lost. But the Night Elves drew upon reserves of strength that even their enemies had not anticipated. The forests themselves seemed to fight alongside them, roots tripping demonic feet and branches striking at exposed flesh. The ancient spirits of Mount Hejal, beings who had watched over this land since the Sundering, lent their power to the defense, and still the demons came, and still the defenders fell, and still the battle raged across the slopes of Mount Hejal. The sacrifice of the defenders at each line was not in vain. Every hour they held gave Malfurion and his druids more time to complete their preparations. The ritual they were performing was complex beyond ordinary magical working, requiring precise coordination between dozens of druids, careful manipulation of natural energies, and the willing sacrifice of the world tree's enchantments. The druids worked in a circle around the base of Nordrassil, their chants rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeat of the world itself. They drew upon the blessing of Ysera, calling to the Emerald Dream for strength. They invoked the power of Nosdormu, touching the flow of time itself. They channeled the gift of Alexstrasza, the life energy that had allowed Nordrassil to grow to such magnificent heights. And they prepared the final component, the one that would require the greatest sacrifice of all, the wisps. Throughout Night Elf history, wisps had been the spirits of ancestors, ethereal beings who watched over the living from their existence beyond death. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense, not echoes of personalities that refused to move on. They were something deeper, fundamental essences that retained a connection to their people even after their bodies had passed away. These wisps could be called upon in times of greatest need. They could lend their strength to the living, could sacrifice what remained of their existence to fuel magical workings of tremendous power. It was a gift, freely given, offered out of love for those who would come after. Malfurion had spent the hours of battle reaching out to these spirits, explaining what was needed, asking for their help. The response had been overwhelming. Wisps had been gathering since the ritual began, drawn by the magnitude of the threat and the depth of the need. They floated among the branches of Nordrassil, thousands upon thousands of tiny lights, waiting for the moment when they would be called to action. The Night Elf defenders knew what was coming. They understood that when the time came, their ancestors would give everything to protect them. It was a humbling thought, and it gave them strength to continue fighting, even as their lines began to break. Among the defenders who fell during the battle were warriors who would have their own chance to contribute. Their spirits joined the gathering wisps, adding their strength to the force that was building around Nordrassil. Even in death, they continued the fight. The moment had arrived. Archimonde had watched his forces grind down the defenders' position by position. He had observed their desperate courage, their refusal to surrender, even in the face of certain defeat. It reminded him of the War of the Ancients, of the stubborn resistance that had denied him victory the first time. But that was 10,000 years ago. He was stronger now, and these defenders were weaker. The Night Elves no longer had their immortality. The humans and orcs were refugees, survivors of already shattered kingdoms. They had no titans to call upon, no dragonflights at full strength, no forces that could match what he had brought to this world. He began his ascent. The mountain itself seemed to resist him. The ancient forests of Hejal had been sanctified by the druids, long ago, imbued with protective magic that made them hostile to demonic intrusion. Trees that had stood for millennia reached out to impede his progress, their branches grasping at his form, their roots rising from the earth to trip his feet. Archimonde brushed these obstacles aside with contempt. He had conquered worlds with greater natural defenses than this. He had broken the will of entire planets that had tried to resist him. These trees, however ancient, however blessed, were nothing to him. The spirits of the forest gathered around him as he climbed, drawn by the magnitude of his corruption. He could feel their hatred, their desperate desire to stop him. They were creatures of life and growth, beings who represented everything the Legion sought to destroy. His very presence was an offense to them, a violation of everything they held sacred. But they could do nothing to stop him. Their power was the power of life, of growth, of renewal. His power was the power of destruction, of annihilation, of the ending of all things. In the eternal struggle between these two forces, destruction had the advantage. It was always easier to burn than to build. The Night Elf defenders who remained tried to slow his progress. Archers fired arrows that sparked against his hide. Druids called down bolts of nature magic that sizzled against his corrupted flesh. Priestesses invoked the power of Elune, sending beams of moonlight that burned like fire where they touched him. He felt these attacks as distant annoyances, like insects buzzing around his head. They could not harm him in any meaningful way. They could not even slow him down. All they could do was delay the inevitable, and they would not even manage that for much longer. The world tree Nordrassil rose before him, its branches reaching toward the sky with a grace that belied its tremendous size. The tree was enormous, larger than any living thing Archimonde had ever seen. Its roots reached deep into the earth, touching the well of eternity that lay hidden beneath the surface. And within that well was the power he sought, the power to become a god. Archimonde's form swelled as he climbed the mountain, fell energy flowing into him from the corruption that surrounded him. By the time he reached the tree, he had grown to titanic size, his head level with the lower branches, his hands large enough to grasp the trunk itself. The remaining defenders tried to stop him. Night elves fired arrows that bounced harmlessly off his demonic hide. Druids hurled nature magic that he swatted aside like gnats. Even the ancient trees that tried to bar his path were swept away by the force of his passage. Nothing could stop him. Nothing would stop him. Archimonde reached Nordrassil and placed his hands upon its trunk. The tree shuddered at his touch, its bark blackening where his fingers pressed against it. He could feel the power beneath, the vast reservoir of energy that flowed up from the well through the tree's roots. It was everything he had dreamed of, everything he had waited 10,000 years to claim. He began to drain it. Energy flowed from the tree into Archimonde's form. The sensation was intoxicating, power beyond anything he had experienced flooding through him. He could feel himself growing stronger with each passing moment, feel the barriers that limited him beginning to fall away. Soon he would be unstoppable. Soon he would rival Sargeras himself. Soon he would be a god. And then he heard the horn. The sound echoed across Mount Hyjal, a clear note that seemed to resonate with the very essence of the land. It was the horn of Cenarius, an artifact that had been crafted in ages past for precisely this purpose. When blown in time of greatest need, it would call upon the ancestral spirits of the forest to defend their home. Malfurion Stormrage lowered the horn and watched as the sky above Nordrassil began to shimmer. They came from everywhere, from the forest and the sky, from the earth and the water. The wisps of Azeroth answered the horn's call. These tiny spirits of light, the souls of night elves who had passed from the mortal world, gathered in numbers beyond counting. They converged on the world tree, on the demon who was attempting to drain its power. Archimonde felt them coming. He looked up from his draining of the well and saw countless points of light descending toward him. For the first time since arriving on Azeroth, he felt something that might have been concern. The wisps were individually weak, barely more than motes of energy. But there were so many of them, thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. They filled the sky above Nordrassil like stars coming to rest upon the earth. And they were not merely gathering. They were channeling their energy into the world tree. Malfurion had prepared this moment for hours, weaving the enchantments that would allow the sacrifice to work. The power of the wisps would flow into Nordrassil, combining with the blessings that the dragon aspects had placed upon the tree millennia ago. The result would be an explosion of pure natural energy, the concentrated life force of all who had given themselves to protect their world. Archimonde tried to pull back, to escape the trap that was forming around him. But the wisps were everywhere now, their light pressing against his form, their energy disrupting the flow of power he had been drawing from the well. He struck at them with his OFL magic, and thousands died, but thousands more took their place. The demon lord roared in rage and frustration. He had come so close, He had touched the power he sought, and now these insignificant spirits, these remnants of dead mortals, dared to interfere with his ascension. He would destroy them all. He would drain every last drop of power from the well and burn every last wisp from the sky. He would not be denied, not again, not after waiting 10,000 years. But the wisps were not attacking him. They were igniting the enchantments within Nordrassil. The explosion that followed was beyond anything that had occurred on Azeroth since the Sundering. Pure natural energy, the concentrated life force of countless spirits, combined with the ancient blessings of the dragon aspects and erupted outward in a wave of devastation. Archimonde was at the epicenter. The demon lord's form was engulfed in light. The corruption of 10,000 years of fell magic seared away by the purity of what struck him. He screamed, a sound of rage and disbelief that echoed across the mountain. He had conquered worlds. He had broken gods. He could not fall to this, could not be destroyed by wisps and trees and the desperate magic of mortals. But he was. The explosion consumed him utterly. When the light faded and the thunder of the detonation died away, nothing remained of Archimonde but charred bones. The Defiler, lieutenant of Sargeras, destroyer of worlds, was no more. The battle for Mount Hyjal was over. The Burning Legion's invasion had been stopped. The surviving defenders looked upon the aftermath with a mixture of exhaustion, grief, and wonder. They had lost so much. So many had died in the fighting. The World Tree itself had been badly damaged, its immortality-granting powers destroyed by the explosion that had killed Archimonde. But they had won. Against all odds, against the full might of the Burning Legion, they had won. Malfurion spoke words that would be remembered for generations. The roots will heal in time, as will the entire world. The sacrifices have been made, just as the orcs, humans, and night elves discarded their old hatreds and stood united against a common foe. So did nature herself rise to banish the shadow forever. The cost had been terrible. The night elves had lost their immortality, sacrificed when the enchantments of Nordrassil were ignited. They would age and die now, like the other mortal races. It was a price many had been unwilling to contemplate, but it was a price they had paid willingly to save their world. The Legion's forces on Azeroth were shattered by their master's death. Without Archimonde to lead them, the demons fell into disarray. Many retreated to the Twisting Nether. Others were hunted down and destroyed by the victorious defenders. The Third War was over. The aftermath of the Battle of Mount Hyjal reshaped the political landscape of Azeroth in ways that would endure for generations. The alliance that had formed to face the Legion did not dissolve entirely when the war ended. Thrall and Jaina maintained contact, working to preserve the fragile peace between their peoples, even as old hatreds threatened to reassert themselves. Thrall led the Horde to establish the nation of Durotar in the harsh lands of eastern Kalimdor. The Orcs named their new homeland after Thrall's father, Durotan, a chieftain who had resisted the Legion's corruption and been murdered for his defiance. The choice of name was deliberate, a statement that this horde would be different from the one that had ravaged Azeroth under demonic influence. The city of Orgrimmar rose from the red earth of Durotar, a testament to Orcish determination and resilience. It was built by hand, stone by stone, by orcs who had finally found freedom from the curse that had haunted their race for a generation. They were joined by the Tauren, who had aided the Horde during their journey across Kalimdor, and who saw in Thrall's vision an opportunity for their own people to flourish. Jaina Proudmoore led her human survivors to the southern marshlands of Kalimdor, where they founded the city of Theramore. It was a refuge for those who had lost everything in the fall of Lordaeron, a place where they could rebuild their lives far from the undead hordes that now controlled their homeland. Jaina herself became one of the most powerful mages in Azeroth, her experiences during the Third War having forged her into a leader of remarkable ability. The Night Elves withdrew to their ancient forests, nursing the wounds they had suffered during the battle. The loss of their immortality was a profound change, one that many of the older elves struggled to accept. For 10,000 years, they had lived with the knowledge that time would not claim them. Now they faced the same mortality as the other races, and it was a difficult adjustment. Nordrassil itself survived the battle, though badly damaged. The explosion that had killed Archimonde had burned away much of the tree's magic, destroying the enchantments that had granted the Night Elves their immortality. The Druids worked to heal the World Tree, but they knew that some of what had been lost could never be restored. The Burning Legion's forces on Azeroth disintegrated following Archimonde's death. Without his leadership, the demons fell into disarray, fighting among themselves as much as against the mortal races. Many were hunted down and destroyed. Others retreated through whatever portals they could find, fleeing back to the Twisting Nether. A few went into hiding, biding their time and waiting for another opportunity to spread chaos. The Scourge, which had served as the Legion's advance force, underwent a transformation of its own. With Archimonde dead and Tichondrius destroyed by Illidan Stormrage, the Lich King reasserted control over the undead armies. He broke from the Legion entirely, pursuing his own agenda of conquest and domination. This would eventually lead to the events of the war against the Lich King, but that is a story for another time. On the slopes of Mount Hyjal, the bones of Archimonde lay where they had fallen. They became a monument of sorts, a reminder of what had been achieved and at what cost. Pilgrims and adventurers would visit the site in later years, marveling at the size of the skeleton and wondering at the power that had been required to destroy such a being. But the bones were also a warning. They reminded those who saw them that the Burning Legion still existed, that the war against the demons was not truly over. Archimonde had been destroyed, but the Legion had other commanders, other forces, other plans. The victory at Mount Hyjal had bought Azeroth time, but it had not ended the threat permanently. And in the Twisting Nether, the essence of Archimonde slowly gathered itself. The power that had destroyed his physical form had not been sufficient to end him permanently. He would return, in time. He would have his revenge. The death of Archimonde at Mount Hyjal seemed to many to be the final chapter in the Defiler's story. A being who had conquered worlds beyond counting, who had survived for millennia as one of the most powerful demons in existence, had finally been destroyed. His bones lay scattered on the slopes of Hyjal, a monument to the power of sacrifice and unity. But the Burning Legion does not accept defeat easily, and for demons of sufficient power, death in the mortal world is not necessarily permanent. Demons, it would later be understood, could only be truly destroyed if they were killed within the Twisting Nether, the chaotic realm between realities where such beings had their origin. When a demon dies in the physical world, its essence returns to the nether, where it can eventually reform and return to existence. Only death within the nether itself would end a daemon permanently. Archimonde's death at Mount Hyjal had occurred in the physical world. His essence had been blasted apart by the detonation of Nordersil's enchantments, but it had not been destroyed. Somewhere in the swirling chaos of the twisting nether, the Defiler's consciousness endured, slowly gathering strength, slowly reforming into a coherent being. Decades passed in the mortal world. The survivors of the Third War rebuilt their civilizations. The Horde established the nation of Durotar in the harsh lands of central Kalimdor. The Alliance survivors under Jaina Proudmoore founded the city of Theramore. The Night Elves withdrew to nurse their wounds and adapt to their new mortality. New threats arose and were dealt with. The Lich King broke free from the Legion's control and launched his own campaign against the living. Deathwing returned and nearly destroyed the world. Garrosh Hellscream became war chief of the Horde and led his people down a path of aggression that culminated in the siege of Orgrimmar. And through it all, in the depths of the twisting nether, Archimonde waited. The opportunity for his return came through an unexpected sequence of events. Garrosh Hellscream escaped captivity with the aid of a renegade bronze dragon named Kairos Dormu. Together, they traveled through time to an alternate version of Draenor, 35 years in the past. In this alternate timeline, Garrosh prevented his father Gromash from drinking Manaroth's blood. Without the demonic corruption, the orcs did not become tools of the Burning Legion. Instead, they united into an Iron Horde, a technological powerhouse that Garrosh hoped to use to conquer Azeroth. The Iron Horde built a dark portal connecting their alternate Draenor to the Azeroth of the present day. They launched an invasion that caught the Alliance and Horde off guard. But the unified forces of Azeroth pushed back, following the Iron Horde through the portal to defeat them on their own ground. On alternate Draenor, the war took unexpected turns. Garrosh was killed. The Iron Horde's leadership fractured, and a new power emerged to take control of what remained. The campaign against the Iron Horde had been long and bloody. Heroes from both the Alliance and Horde had fought their way across alternate Draenor, liberating territories that had fallen under Iron Horde control, forming alliances with the local inhabitants, and slowly pushing the invaders back to their strongholds. The Draenei of alternate Draenor had been particularly affected by the conflict. In the main timeline, the Draenei had been devastated by the Orcish Horde, their population reduced to a fraction of what it had once been. In this alternate timeline, the Orcs had not been corrupted by demonic blood, but they had still attacked the Draenei under Garrosh's direction. The violence had been different in nature, but similar in scale. Eiril had emerged from these conflicts as a leader of her people. She had been an ordinary Draenei when the war began, a refugee like so many others. But the trials she faced had forged her into something more. She had discovered a connection to the light that few Draenei possessed, a gift that made her a formidable paladin and an inspiring figure to those around her. The orcs of alternate Draenor had undergone their own transformation. Without the demonic corruption that had twisted their counterparts in the main timeline, they remained true to their original culture. They were fierce and proud, but they were not mindlessly savage. When the Iron Horde's true nature was revealed, when Gul'dan's influence became apparent, many orcs turned against what their horde had become. Gromish Hellscream, who had led the Iron Horde as its war chief, found himself facing a choice that echoed the one his counterpart had faced in the main timeline. He could continue to serve the forces that were corrupting his people, or he could stand against them and try to reclaim the honor that had been lost. In the end, Gromish chose to fight. It was a decision that would have surprised those who knew him only as the leader of the Iron Horde. But those who understood Orcish culture recognized it as the only choice a true warrior could make. The Iron Horde had become a tool of the Legion. No orc with honor could serve such masters. This power was Gul'dan, or rather, an alternate version of Gul'dan from this alternate timeline. Like his counterpart in the main timeline, this Gul'dan was a warlock of tremendous power and overwhelming ambition. He saw in the weakened Iron Horde an opportunity to serve his true masters, the Burning Legion. Gul'dan corrupted what remained of the Iron Horde, transforming it into a force devoted to demonic service. He took control of Hellfire Citadel, the massive fortress that had been the Iron Horde's seat of power, and he began the work of summoning the Legion to alternate Draenor. And at the head of the Legion's forces, answering Gul'dan's call, came Archimonde. The Defiler's return was made possible by a fundamental truth about demonic existence that the people of Azeroth had not fully understood. Demons did not exist in the same way that mortal beings existed. They were creatures of the Twisting Nether, bound to that chaotic realm in ways that transcended the physical world. When they died in mortal worlds, their essence returned to the Nether, where it could eventually reform. This meant that the same Archimonde who had been destroyed at Mount Hijel was now standing on alternate Draenor. He was not a copy or a different version from another timeline. He was the original, the same demon who had led the Legion's first invasion of Azeroth, who had destroyed Dalaran, who had been destroyed by the wisps at Nordrassil. He remembered everything, including the humiliation of his defeat and the millennia he had spent reforming in the Nether. The experience had changed him. Where once he had been confident to the point of arrogance, he was now cautious. He understood that the defenders of Azeroth possessed capabilities that he had underestimated. He knew that overconfidence could lead to defeat, even for a being of his power. He would not make the same mistakes again, but he was also eager. The opportunity to finally complete his conquest of Azeroth, to claim the power that had been denied to him for so long, was within reach. Gul'dan had promised to deliver this world to the Legion, and Archimonde intended to hold him to that promise. The portal through which he had arrived was different from the ones the Legion typically used. It was connected to both alternate Draenor and the Azeroth of the primary timeline, a two-way gateway that could serve the Legion's purposes in multiple ways. Through it, demons could pour into alternate Draenor to complete the conquest of that world, and through it, eventually, the Legion could launch a new invasion of the Azeroth that had defied them so many times. Archimonde surveyed the battlefield that awaited him. Hellfire Citadel was a fortress worthy of the Legion, its walls radiating with fell energy, its defenders a mixture of corrupted orcs and summoned demons. Beyond its walls lay the forces that had come to stop him, a coalition of heroes from both Azeroth and alternate Draenor who had fought their way through the Citadel's defenses to reach this final confrontation. He recognized some of them. Khadgar, the mage who had once been apprenticed to Medivh, had grown into a formidable power in his own right. Earl, a Draenei paladin who had risen from obscurity during the war on alternate Draenor, radiated the holy power that demons found so painful. And there was Gromish Hellscream, the orc whose son had created the Iron Horde, and whose own stubbornness had finally turned against the legion he had been serving. These were not the same enemies he had faced at Mount Hejal. They were different heroes from a different era, but they shared the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had characterized Azeroth's defenders throughout history. They had come here knowing they might die, knowing that Archimonde was one of the most powerful beings in existence, and they had come anyway. Archimonde respected that in his way. He had always appreciated worthy opponents. It made their destruction more satisfying. The Hellfire Citadel had been transformed. What had once been a testament to orcish engineering and Iron Horde might was now a monument to demonic corruption. Fell energy pulsed through its walls. Demons walked its corridors. The sky above burned with the sickly green light of the Twisting Nether. At the Citadel's heart, the ritual site known as the Black Gate served as a portal through which the Burning Legion's forces could enter alternate Draenor. It was here that Gul'dan performed the summoning that would bring Archimonde back to the mortal world. The Defiler's emergence from the Black Gate was witnessed by those who had come to stop the Legion. Khadgar, the archmage who had once been Medivh's apprentice, led a coalition of heroes from both Azeroth and alternate Draenor. Irel, a Draenei paladin who had risen to leadership during the war, stood ready to face the demon who had helped destroy her people's homeworld. Even Gromish Hellscream, whose Iron Horde had started this entire conflict, had turned against the Legion and joined the defenders. Archimonde stepped through the portal with a confidence born of millennia of conquest. He looked upon the forces arrayed against him and saw nothing that concerned him. These mortals had surprised him at Mount Hejal, had used tricks and sacrifices to destroy his physical form, but he had learned from that defeat. He would not be caught off guard again. The time for subtlety has passed, he declared, his voice echoing across the citadel. Kil'jaeden had tried manipulation and corruption. He had failed. Now Archimonde would do what he did best. He would destroy everything in his path with overwhelming force. The sky will rain fire. The oceans will be filled with blood. Draenor will burn. The battle that followed was one of the most intense ever fought on any version of Draenor. Archimonde brought the full extent of his power to bear against the defenders, raining destruction upon them while summoning waves of demons to supplement his attacks. The heroes who faced him were among the mightiest their world had produced, veterans of countless battles who had saved Azeroth from threats beyond number. The fighting progressed through multiple stages. Archimonde opened by devastating the area around him with massive Ethel attacks, forcing the defenders to scatter and regroup. He summoned infernals from the sky, giant constructs of rock and fell fire that crashed down upon the battlefield. He bound souls with dark magic, tormented spirits with shadows, and demonstrated why he had earned the title of Defiler. The defenders adapted to each new threat. Healers worked frantically to keep their allies alive through damage that would have killed lesser warriors instantly. Tanks absorbed punishment that should have been fatal, their armor glowing with protective enchantments. Those who dealt damage struck at Archimonde again and again, slowly but surely wearing down even his immense reserves of power. Khadgar and the other magical leaders coordinated efforts to counter Archimonde's spells. When the Demon Lord attempted massive area attacks, they erected barriers to protect the most vulnerable. When he summoned demons, they focused fire to eliminate the reinforcements before they could overwhelm the defenders. Irel fought with the righteous fury of one whose entire people had suffered at the hands of the Legion. Her hammer, blessed by the light, struck blows that cut through Archimonde's demonic defenses. She rallied the Draenei warriors who fought alongside her, reminding them that this was the being who had helped orchestrate the corruption of the Eredar so long ago. Gromish Hellscream, wielding his legendary axe Gorehowl, threw himself at the Demon Lord with abandon. He had made so many mistakes, had caused so much suffering through his pride and his rage. Here was a chance for redemption, a chance to strike a blow against the true enemy of all free peoples. The battle reached its climax when Archimonde, weakened but not defeated, made a decision that would have consequences beyond anything the defenders anticipated. He tore open a rift to the Twisting Nether itself, drawing the entire battlefield into the chaotic realm between realities. The decision to fight in the Twisting Nether was a calculated gamble. Archimonde understood the implications better than anyone. He knew that death in the Nether would be permanent, that there would be no reformation, no return. But he also knew that his power in the Nether was greater than it could ever be in the physical world. Here, closer to the source of demonic energy, his abilities would be amplified beyond their normal limits. He also understood something about his enemies that they might not have understood about themselves. They were mortal. They had followed him into a realm where the very air was toxic to living beings, where reality itself was fluid and hostile. Every moment they spent in the Nether weakened them, while every moment strengthened him. Or so he believed. The Twisting Nether was a realm of chaos, a dimension where the normal rules of physics and magic did not apply. The sky above them swirled with impossible colors. The ground beneath their feet shifted and changed without warning. The horizon stretched into infinity in some directions and curved back on itself in others. Demons thrived in this environment. They were creatures of the Nether, born from its substance and sustained by its energies. For them, being in the Nether was like being home. They were faster here, stronger here, more resilient than they could ever be in the physical world. But the heroes who faced Archimonde were not ordinary mortals. They had been forged in battles against threats that would have broken lesser beings. They had survived encounters with old gods and dragon aspects and the Lich King himself. They carried artifacts of tremendous power, wielded abilities that had been honed through years of combat against the worst the universe could offer. And they had something else that Archimonde had underestimated. They had hope. Not the naive hope of those who had never faced true darkness, but the tempered hope of those who had looked into the abyss and refused to be consumed by it. They had seen the worst that could happen, and they had chosen to fight anyway. In the Nether, the rules were different. Here, Archimonde was closer to the source of his power. Here, the fell energies that sustained him flowed more freely. But here also, death would be final. There would be no reformation, no return. If Archimonde died in the Twisting Nether, he would be gone forever. The demon lord apparently believed the trade was worth it. He was confident that his power in the Nether would be sufficient to destroy his enemies once and for all. He was wrong. The heroes who had followed him into the Nether fought with the desperation of those who knew this was their last chance. They had no retreat, no backup, no possibility of resurrection if they fell. Everything depended on this moment. Archimonde's attacks became increasingly frantic as his power waned. He had expended too much energy in the earlier stages of the battle, had assumed that his foes would break before he had to reveal the full extent of his abilities. Now he found himself facing opponents who refused to give up, who matched his every attack with their own. The final blow, when it came, was anticlimactic in its simplicity. Archimonde the Defiler, lieutenant of Sargeras, destroyer of worlds beyond counting, simply could not withstand the accumulated damage any longer. His form began to destabilize, fell energy bleeding from wounds that could not heal. With his last conscious thought, Archimonde reached out to Gul'dan, the warlock who had summoned him, who had promised to deliver this world to the Legion, would not escape his obligations. A beam of green energy erupted from the dying demon lord, striking Gul'dan and propelling him through space and time. "Remember the pact you made," Archimonde's fading voice echoed in Gul'dan's ears. The beam deposited the warlock on Azeroth, specifically at the tomb of Sargeras. There, Gul'dan would fulfill his purpose. He would open a new portal, one that would allow the Legion to invade Azeroth in greater numbers than ever before. Archimonde's death was permanent this time. Destroyed in the Twisting Nether, there was no essence to return, no consciousness to reform. The Defiler was gone, truly and finally gone. His story ended at last. But the consequences of his final act would shake Azeroth to its foundations. The Legion invasion that Gul'dan would enable would be the greatest the world had ever faced. It would take everything the defenders of Azeroth had to survive what was coming. Archimonde had lost his own life, but he had ensured that his master's vision would continue. The burning Legion would not be stopped so easily. The events that followed Archimonde's death on alternate Draenor unfolded exactly as the Defiler had intended. Gul'dan arrived at the tomb of Sargeras on Azeroth, the ancient structure that had once been the Temple of Elune in Suramar, before it was corrupted by the avatar of Sargeras and sunk beneath the waves. Within the tomb, Gul'dan found what he sought. Using his formidable magical abilities and the power granted to him by the Legion, he began the process of opening a portal that would allow the demons to invade Azeroth in greater numbers than ever before. It was the culmination of plans that stretched back millennia, the final act of a strategy that Archimonde himself had helped to develop. The Legion invasion that followed was the largest the world had ever faced. Demons poured through portals across Azeroth, attacking the Broken Isles, the ancient kingdoms of the Eastern Kingdoms, and every other populated region they could reach. The Horde and Alliance were forced to unite once again, setting aside their differences to face the common threat. The war was long and costly. Many heroes fell in the fighting. Entire organizations were shattered, their members killed or scattered. The world itself seemed on the brink of destruction as the Legion's forces pushed ever deeper into Azeroth's defenses. But ultimately, the defenders prevailed. Through a combination of heroism, sacrifice, and the intervention of forces that even the Legion had not anticipated, Sargeras himself was drawn out and imprisoned by the remaining Titans. The Burning Crusade, the endless war that had consumed worlds beyond counting, was finally brought to an end. Archimonde's role in this final victory was ironic. By sending Gul'dan to Azeroth, he had set in motion the chain of events that would lead to his master's defeat. The invasion that was meant to finally conquer the world that had defied the Legion instead led to the Legion's destruction. The Defiler had, in the end, defiled his own cause. But such ironies are little comfort to the countless worlds that fell to Archimonde's armies over the millennia. The civilizations he destroyed, the peoples he exterminated, the potential he snuffed out, these losses cannot be recovered. The cosmos is poorer for his existence, scarred by the mark of his passage. The Defiler's legacy extended beyond his own existence. In the years that followed his death, fragments of his power and influence continued to surface across the cosmos. Within the ruins of Hellfire Citadel, investigators found artifacts that had belonged to Archimonde or had been created through his power. The Infernal Codex, a tome of demonic knowledge, was discovered among his remains. This book contained secrets about the creation and control of infernal demons, knowledge that unscrupulous warlocks would pay dearly to obtain. The skull of Thal'kiel, the artifact that had connected Archimonde to Sargeras' whispers so long ago, had its own fate. During the Legion's invasion of Azeroth, warlocks who specialized in demon summoning discovered the skull and learned to use its power for themselves. The skull of the Minari became an artifact of considerable significance, its history stretching back to the days before the Legion's formation. On Argus itself, the eredar homeworld that had been transformed into the Legion's seat of power, echoes of Archimonde could be found. Statues and monuments commemorated his conquests. Demons who had served under him remembered his commands and his expectations. The systems he had put in place for organizing military operations continued to function even in his absence. The souls of those who had died in the Twisting Nether, including Archimonde's, were believed to be lost forever. Unlike demons who died in the physical world, those destroyed in the Nether had no refuge, no place where their essence could reform. They were simply gone, their consciousness scattered into the chaos. Some scholars have speculated about what Archimonde's final moments might have been like. For a being who had existed for hundreds of millennia, who had seen the rise and fall of civilizations beyond counting, who had wielded power that would have made him a god on lesser worlds, the experience of dissolution must have been uniquely horrifying. He had always believed in his own invincibility, his own inevitability. To feel that belief crumble as his essence came apart must have been a form of existential terror that few beings have ever experienced. Others have wondered whether there was any moment of regret, any flash of understanding about what he had become and what he had lost. The young mage on Argus, who had dreamed of glory and power, the ambitious apprentice who had betrayed his master for advancement, the eredar lord who had accepted corruption in exchange for promises of godhood, were any of these beings still present in the demon that Archimonde had become? Did any part of him, in those final seconds of dissolution, remember what it had been like to be something other than a monster? We will never know. Whatever thoughts passed through Archimonde's consciousness as he died were scattered along with the rest of him. There is no record of his final moments, no last words preserved for posterity. He simply ceased to exist, his story ending not with a dramatic final speech, but with the simple reality of oblivion. Perhaps that is the most fitting end for a being who had inflicted oblivion upon so many others. He had destroyed civilizations, erased histories, eliminated entire species from existence. Now the same fate had come for him. The Defiler had been defiled in the most fundamental way possible, reduced from a being of cosmic significance to nothing at all. But even in death, Archimonde had shaped events that would unfold for years to come. The invasion he had enabled through Gul'dan's portal brought the Legion to Azeroth in unprecedented numbers. The Burning Throne, Sargeras' seat of power, was opened to mortal assault. And in the final confrontation of the Legion's invasion, the Titans themselves intervened, imprisoning Sargeras and ending the Burning Crusade once and for all. Archimonde's story, then, is one of ambition without limit. From his earliest days as an apprentice on Argus, he sought power above all else. He betrayed his master to gain standing among the eredar leaders. He accepted Sargeras' corruption without hesitation, seeing in it the path to the godhood he craved. He destroyed worlds beyond counting, reveled in the annihilation of civilizations, and pursued the power to rival the Dark Titan himself. Twice he came to Azeroth, and twice that world's defenders found a way to stop him. At Mount Hyjal, the wisps and the sacrifice of Nordrassil's enchantments destroyed his physical form. At Hellfire Citadel, the heroes of two worlds followed him into the Twisting Nether and ensured his final death. There is a pattern to these defeats that speaks to something fundamental about Archimonde's nature. Both times, he was undone not by superior military force, but by the willingness of his enemies to sacrifice themselves. At Mount Kil'jaeden, the Night Elves gave up their immortality, and their ancestors gave up their very existence. At Hellfire Citadel, mortal heroes followed him into a realm where death was permanent, accepting that they might never return. Archimonde could not understand this kind of sacrifice because he could not experience it. Demons do not truly sacrifice themselves. They know that death in the physical world is temporary, that they will reform in the nether and return. This knowledge colors everything they do, makes genuine sacrifice impossible for them. But mortals can sacrifice themselves completely. They can give everything, knowing that they will not get it back. This capacity for absolute sacrifice gives them a power that demons cannot match, a strength that comes not from foul energy or ancient magic, but from the simple willingness to pay any price for what they love. Archimonde never understood this. He saw mortality as a weakness, a limitation that made lesser beings easy to dominate and destroy. He did not realize that mortality could also be a source of strength, that the knowledge of death could inspire beings to acts of courage and sacrifice that immortal demons would never comprehend. In the end, Archimonde failed to achieve what he truly wanted. He never became a god. He never gained power equal to Sargeras. He never conquered Azeroth. The world that had denied him victory 10,000 years ago denied him again and again until his story was finally over. But the Burning Legion lives on in diminished form. Demons still lurk in the Twisting Nether, waiting for opportunities to corrupt and destroy. The scars that Archimonde left upon the worlds he conquered will take millennia to heal, if they ever do, and the lessons of his story about ambition and corruption and the price of power remain relevant to all who would follow similar paths. The Defiler is dead, but the echoes of his deeds resound still across the cosmos, reminders of what was lost and what was saved in the endless struggle between life and destruction. When we look back upon Archimonde's story, certain themes emerge that speak to something fundamental about the nature of ambition and power. He began as a talented young mage on a world of extraordinary advancement. He possessed gifts that set him apart from his peers, abilities that should have allowed him to achieve great things within the existing order. But he wanted more than what the existing order could offer. He wanted not just to succeed, but to dominate. He wanted not just power, but absolute power. This hunger led him to betray his master, Thal'kiel. It led him to accept the corruption of Sargeras without hesitation. It led him to destroy worlds beyond counting in pursuit of the godhood he craved. And in the end, it led him to his death in the Twisting Nether, destroyed by the defenders of a world he had twice failed to conquer. The irony of Archimonde's fate is that he never truly understood what he was fighting against. He saw the defenders of Azeroth as obstacles to be overcome, problems to be solved through sufficient application of force. He did not comprehend that their resistance was not merely tactical, but existential, that they fought not because they believed they could win, but because they could not accept the alternative. At Mount Hijal, the wisps who destroyed Archimonde were not soldiers or warriors. They were the spirits of night elves who had already died, ancestors who rose from the beyond to protect their descendants. They sacrificed what remained of their existence, gave up their eternal rest, because they could not bear to see their world fall to the darkness. It was an act of love, not strategy, and Archimonde had no defense against love. At Hellfire Citadel, the heroes who followed Archimonde into the Twisting Nether knew they might not survive. They pursued him anyway, because they understood that allowing him to escape would mean more worlds burned, more peoples exterminated, more suffering across the cosmos. They chose certain death over allowing certain evil to continue. It was an act of courage that the Defiler, for all his power, could never have understood. In the end, Archimonde was defeated not by superior force, but by superior spirit. The defenders of Azeroth possessed something that the Burning Legion, for all its millennia of conquest, had never developed: the capacity to sacrifice for others. Archimonde could command his demons through fear and power, but he could not inspire them to true devotion. His enemies could, and that made all the difference. There is a lesson in this, perhaps, for those who would follow Archimonde's path. Power without purpose is ultimately hollow. Ambition without limit is ultimately self-destructive. The strongest empires, the mightiest conquerors, the most terrible tyrants, all of them eventually fall, brought down not by greater power, but by the accumulated resistance of those they sought to dominate. Archimonde could have been something different. On Argus, before Sargeras' corruption, he had the potential to lead his people to even greater achievements. He could have used his talents to advance the cause of knowledge and civilization rather than destruction, He could have been remembered as a great leader rather than a great monster. But he made his choices, and those choices led him to his end. The universe is perhaps better for his absence, though the cost of removing him was paid in the lives of millions across countless worlds. We can only hope that those who witnessed his rise and fall will learn from his example, will understand that the path of unlimited ambition leads ultimately to the Twisting Nether, where even the most powerful demons can be destroyed. The stars continue to shine. The worlds that survived the Burning Crusade continue to turn. Life goes on, as it always has, building and creating and reaching for something better. Archimonde would have snuffed out all of this, would have reduced the cosmos to ash and silence. But he failed, and in his failure, life was given another chance to flourish. Perhaps that is the ultimate legacy of Archimonde the Defiler. Not the worlds he destroyed, but the worlds he failed to destroy. Not the peoples he exterminated, but the peoples who survived to remember them. Not the darkness he spread, but the light that remained when the darkness was finally overcome. The Defiler is dead. Long live the light. For those who live in the shadow of the Legion's passing, there are lessons to be drawn from Archimonde's story. His tale reminds us that power without wisdom leads to destruction, that ambition unchecked by conscience becomes its own undoing. It reminds us that even the mightiest beings can be brought low by those who fight, not for conquest, but for love. The heroes who defeated Archimonde at Kil'jaeden and at Hellfire Citadel did not fight because they wanted power or glory. They fought because they could not stand by while darkness consumed everything they cherished. Their motivation was not the hope of reward, but the certainty that some things are worth dying for. This is the lesson that Archimonde never learned. For all his intelligence, for all his cunning, he could not comprehend the power of sacrifice. He thought that offering his followers power would make them loyal, that threatening them with destruction would make them obedient. He never understood that true devotion cannot be bought or coerced. The armies of the Legion followed their commanders out of fear and greed. The defenders of Azeroth followed their leaders out of hope and love. In the end, hope and love proved stronger. They always do. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you will dream of ancient Argus, of shining spires reaching toward violet skies. Perhaps you will see a young mage with ambitious eyes, standing at a crossroads that would determine the fate of a universe. And perhaps you will understand, as he never did, that the greatest power is not the power to destroy, but the power to protect. The stars shine on worlds that Archimonde never touched. Children are born who will never know his name. Life continues, as it always has, building and growing and reaching for the light. This is the legacy of those who stood against the darkness. This is the victory that the Defiler could never take away. If you enjoyed this journey through the complete story of Archimonde, please consider subscribing to World of Sleepcraft for more tales from the Warcraft universe. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories to life. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful and your rest be deep.